Chapter 1. The frost fair at Marleycombe snow had fallen overnight upon Marleycombe, soft and fine, coating the rooftops, hedges and the little green in a glistening frost. By 10 o'clock that morning the village was out in force. The annual frost fair was the pride of Marleycombe, a cheerful affair of homemade jams, knitted scarves and gossip far more dangerous than the weather. Mrs. Pym from the post office had set up her usual table near the church gate, and old Mr. Jessup, the verger, was fussing about the nativity scene, muttering that the donkey was decidedly crooked. Children ran to and fro, shrieking with delight, their breath puffing white in the cold air. Miss Jane Marple, small, neat, and wrapped in a sensible grey coat, stood beside the tomb of one Captain Everard, long dead and, so far as anyone knew, unmurdered. She had been examining the crochet work on display with mild admiration and quiet amusement. People, she reflected, always tell more about themselves by what they make than by what they say. From her vantage she could see almost all of the fair, the white marquee for tea and cakes, the raffle table, and the small wooden sign for the old mill bed and breakfast just visible beyond the green. It was there, Miss Marple thought, that something quite out of the ordinary would occur before the day was done. At precisely 11:30, as the vicar mounted the steps of the parish hall to announce the drawing of the Christmas hamper, a sharp cry rang out. It was Mrs. Calthorpe, the landlady of the old mill B&B, her red shawl vivid against the snow as she ran, breathless, toward the green. "Oh, good heavens," she gasped. "He's dead! He's dead!" A dozen heads turned. Teacups were abandoned mid-sip. The vicar's raffle speech faltered. "Dead?" repeated Mrs. Pym, eyes wide. "Who's dead?" Mrs. Calthorpe could scarcely speak. "Mr. Henry Blackwell, my guest, in room 3. I went to fetch more towels and, oh, dear Lord." There was a moment of stunned silence. The only sound was the faint rustle of the snow and the tolling of the church clock. Then, like ripples from a stone in water, whispers began to spread. "Heart attack, surely. He looked so fit, didn't he? Always kept to himself. London man, wasn't he?" Miss Marple alone did not move. Her eyes, a faded blue that missed nothing, were fixed on Mrs. Calthorpe's trembling hands, and on the small patch of dark wool clinging to her mitten. "Strange," murmured Miss Marple softly. "That thread, it isn't from her shawl." Within the hour the police had arrived, Inspector Craddock from Downshire, a solid man with more confidence than subtlety. By midday, the frost fair had dissolved into fearful chatter and shuttered stalls. At the old mill the scene was grim. Mr. Henry Blackwell, a gentleman of about 50, lay across his bed, one shoe removed, his face turned toward the fire as though seeking its warmth. A cup of tea sat on the bedside table untouched. Inspector Craddock frowned. "Looks like a stroke to me," he said. "Doctor will confirm, but I'd wager there's nothing sinister." Miss Marple, who had somehow found her way into the hallway, having brought Mrs. Calthorpe a restorative cup of cocoa, stood quite still. Her gaze rested on the empty teacup beside Mrs. Calthorpe's tray. "If I might say so," she murmured gently, "people rarely make themselves tea and then forget to drink it, unless, of course, they've been interrupted." Craddock looked at her, half amused, half wary. "And who might have interrupted him, Miss Marple?" The old lady smiled, a faint, knowing smile that never quite reached her eyes. "That, Inspector, is what we shall have to find out." Outside, the church bell tolled noon. Snow began to fall again, softly, silently, covering the footprints that led to the old mill, and somewhere, among the polite villagers of Marleycombe, someone already knew the truth. Chapter 2. Whispers over tea. By the following morning, Marleycombe was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. The frost fair was forgotten, the raffle prizes unclaimed. Instead, the talk everywhere, from the bakery queue to the pews of St. Michael's, was of murder. For though the police had not yet called it that, the villagers had decided quite firmly that it must be so. At the Bluebell tea rooms, 3 elderly ladies sat close together, voices lowered, knitting needles clicking in the background hum of gossip. "It was poison, I heard," said Mrs. Pym in a thrilled whisper. "In his tea. You know, she brought it up herself." "She?" asked Mrs. Dacres, leaning in. "Mrs. Calthorpe, of course, and she's always been a nervous sort. My Bert says—" Her words were cut off by the doorbell's jingle. Every head turned. Miss Marple had entered, her grey coat neatly buttoned, gloves folded in one hand, and a small air of mild concern about her. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "A pot of Darjeeling, if I may, and perhaps a currant bun." The ladies greeted her eagerly, for Miss Marple was both beloved and secretly feared. The sort of woman who seemed to know things one had not even told one's own husband. Mrs. Pym lowered her voice again. "You've heard, of course, about the dreadful business at the old mill." Miss Marple seated herself and nodded gently. Indeed, Mrs. Calthorpe was most distressed, a dreadful shock to her, I'm sure. "Dr. Lanning says it might not have been natural," added Mrs. Dacres darkly. "Said there was something odd about the man's lips, a bluish tinge. That's poison if ever there was." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Or the effect of the cold," she said mildly. "One mustn't jump to conclusions, dear." But her eyes were thoughtful. She had seen that cup, the faint brown ring where liquid had been, poured, but never sipped. She had also noticed in the scuffle of footprints outside the guest house, one set smaller and lighter than the rest. A woman's, yet with the distinct heel mark of a London-made shoe. Later that afternoon, Inspector Craddock paid a visit to Miss Marple's cottage, ostensibly to thank her for keeping the villagers calm, though his tone suggested he thought her interference inevitable. "I've had the post-mortem," he said briskly. "Heart failure, most likely. No sign of struggle, no marks. Doctor's cautious, but I'll stake my reputation it's natural causes." Miss Marple poured him tea delicately. "And yet you look unconvinced." Craddock hesitated. "Well, it's odd. The man had no relatives, no luggage save one small case, and paid Mrs. Calthorpe in cash. Said he was taking a little rest from London business." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "And did anyone in the village know him?" "Apparently not, though Mrs. Calthorpe claims he was polite and quiet. Kept mostly to himself. Arrived 3 days ago, said he'd be gone before Christmas." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. 3 days? And did he receive any visitors?" Craddock frowned. "No one that she mentioned." She said, refilling his cup. "People sometimes neglect to mention what they think unimportant. Did Mrs. Calthorpe, for instance, mention that she'd quarrelled with her maid the day before?" Craddock stared. "How on earth did you—" "She was crying into her cocoa when I saw her," Miss Marple replied placidly, "and her apron pocket was torn, quite neatly, as if someone had pulled something from it." Craddock sighed. "You've been talking to people again, haven't you, Miss Marple? Listening, Inspector, people talk quite without realising it." That evening Miss Marple took a quiet walk along the lane leading to the old mill. The snow had frozen into a crisp white crust. Lights glowed warmly behind curtained windows. A black cat darted across her path. Mrs. Calthorpe opened the door herself, looking pale and worn. "Oh, Miss Marple, I hardly slept," she confessed. "It's dreadful, having a death under one's roof. They'll never come back, the guests. I'm ruined." "My dear, I'm sure that's not true," Miss Marple said kindly. "You've always been most conscientious. Might I come in for just a moment?" The sitting room was over-decorated, full of lace doilies and stiff furniture. A fire burned low. On the mantelpiece stood a photograph of a man in uniform, Mrs. Calthorpe's late husband. "I brought you a few lavender biscuits," Miss Marple said. "They do one good when one's nerves are shaken." "That's very kind," said Mrs. Calthorpe, trying to smile. "If only I knew why he came here. He seemed uneasy, always glancing out the window as if he expected someone." Miss Marple nodded. "Fear has many faces. Did he receive any letters?" Mrs. Calthorpe hesitated. "Only one, yesterday morning. Thick paper, expensive. I remember because the postmark was smudged. He put it straight into his pocket." "And you didn't happen to see who it was from?" She shook her head. "No name, just private." Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the mantelpiece to a small brass key lying beside the clock. "Oh, that! It's to the garden shed," said Mrs. Calthorpe. "We keep extra coal there." "Ah," murmured Miss Marple, "how practical." But she did not miss the faint trace of dust around the key, nor the fact that someone had turned it recently. The next morning Marleycombe awoke to the sound of wheels on snow. A black motor car had arrived, from London. Out stepped a tall, angular man in a dark coat, his expression severe. He introduced himself at once as Mr. Edmund Blackwell, brother of the deceased. The villagers gathered near the post office to watch. "Did you know he had a brother?" "No, nor anyone else, I fancy. London sort, isn't he? Always trouble when they come down here." By midday, the stranger had gone to the police station, and rumour declared he was furious, demanding a full inquiry. That evening Miss Marple dined quietly on soup and bread, knitting by the fire as the clock ticked. At 7:30, there came a knock at her door. It was Inspector Craddock again, looking exasperated. "You'll never guess," he said grimly. "The brother insists there was money missing from the dead man's things. A cheque-book, some papers. He says his brother was carrying them when he left London." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "And were they found?" "No, only the letter Mrs. Calthorpe mentioned, burned halfway in the grate. All that was left were the words, 'Meet me before Christmas. We must settle this.'" Miss Marple looked into the fire. "Then I dare say, Inspector, that this was no ordinary visitor at all," Craddock frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," said Miss Marple gently, "that Mr. Henry Blackwell did not come to Marleycombe for rest. He came to meet someone he trusted, and that someone, I fear, saw to it he would never leave." Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. In the distance, the church clock struck 8, and in the silence that followed, Miss Marple's eyes glinted like ice in the firelight. "People," she murmured, "are seldom what they appear, Inspector, especially at Christmas." Chapter 3. The Shadow of the Past. The day dawned faintly pink over Marleycombe, the snow crusted and glittering like crushed sugar. Chimneys smoked, shop doors unlatched, and the neat sweep of brooms on thresholds seemed a collective effort to brush away the village's disquiet. It did not, of course, succeed. Miss Marple, who believed quite firmly that truth often lurked in small tidying motions, set her cottage to rights at 8:30, placed a single hyacinth bulb on the kitchen sill, and prepared to call upon the vicar's wife. Mrs. Weatherby, a thin, sprightly soul of infallible memory, was the village's other repository of detail, though, unlike Miss Marple, she possessed no system save that of perpetual bustle. "You have heard, of course," Mrs. Weatherby began, ushering Miss Marple into the vicarage sitting-room where a faded chintz sofa fought gamely against an army of hymn-books, "that the deceased gentleman had a brother who is by all accounts most disagreeable." Miss Marple folded her gloves. "I have met the type," she said mildly. "Quite. He arrived like a curate's egg and stormed about as if the parish were his to command. I dare say the inspector will wish to do something decisive at last, though dear Mr. Weatherby says rash action is the devil's own invitation to error." "Your husband is a most sensible man," Miss Marple said, accepting tea. "Tell me, my dear, do you recall anything particular about the old Mill's guests this past fortnight? Mrs. Calthorpe has been most successful since the summer." Mrs. Weatherby brightened. "Indeed she has. A charming couple from Bath, a novelist who shut himself up and glared at everyone, a pretty girl with a blue hat who came for merely one night, rather too smart for Marleycombe. Ah, and a man who asked me the way to the station 2 mornings ago, city sort, narrow eyes, smelt faintly of hair oil." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the hyacinth in the window. "The pretty girl with the blue hat. When was that?" "Why, the day before the Frost Fair. She didn't stay for breakfast, left a few coins for Mrs. Calthorpe and went by the footpath at the back. The vicar watched her from the study. He thought she looked, how did he put it, as if she wore her courage on the outside." Mrs. Weatherby chuckled, then sobered. "It isn't nice, is it, dear, to think we've become the kind of village where people come to do unpleasant things?" Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Villages are rather like families," she said. "The unpleasant things happen whether or not one is looking. Only in a village the curtains are thin." When she took her leave, Miss Marple did not go directly home. A narrow lane ran behind the vicarage, edging the meadows until it came up shyly against the back garden of the old mill. The snow lay there in a smooth sheet save for a scatter of prints, the broad soles of the constable, the neat ovals of Mrs. Calthorpe's boots, and something lighter, a woman's step to be sure, the heel distinct with a small metal tack, London made. But Miss Marple, who had mended more than her share of village shoes after the war, noted another thing. The heel had been repaired twice, once clumsily, once well. A thrifty woman then, or perhaps one obliged to make do. She tested the garden shed door. The brass key had been replaced on the mantelpiece, but the lock itself bore a tiny smear of black. Stove polish, very faint where a finger had slipped. The boards inside smelt of coal dust and apples. She drew her hand along a shelf. There, beneath a row of flower pots, lay a butter tin with a dented lid. Inside were ashes, paper ashes, fine and grey, and 2 fragments not wholly consumed. One showed the edge of a printed heading, Pibza and Kosen, solicitors. The other a date, 18th of December. Miss Marple replaced the tin with care and stood quite still, thinking of the burned letter in Mr. Blackwell's grate, of the brother with his outraged talk of papers, and of the nervous landlady whose apron had been neatly torn. She was still thinking when a figure appeared at the garden gate. The maid, a narrow-faced girl with anxious eyes. "Oh," she started. "Miss Marple, you gave me a fright." "I'm so sorry, my dear," Miss Marple said. "You must be Violet. Mrs. Calthorpe mentioned you were out of sorts." Violet bit her lip, the effort of control plain in her thin shoulders. "I don't want no trouble, miss. Honest, I don't. It's a horrible business, and I'm that sorry for Mrs. Calthorpe. But if Inspector Craddock is asking, I didn't touch the gentleman's things." "Did someone suggest you had?" The girl's eyes filled. "Mr. Edmund said as how servants see too much, and that thieving is in the class of it. He's a brute, if you ask me." She dashed a sleeve across her face. "I never took nothing that weren't mine, not ever." Miss Marple laid a gloved hand on the girl's arm. "I believe you, Violet. Tell me, did anyone call at the back door the day Mr. Blackwell died?" Violet hesitated. I didn't think it important. There was a knock, soft-like, just after 11. I was upstairs with the Hoover and I heard Mrs. Calthorpe go herself. Later I asked who it was and she said it was no one. But she looked as if she'd seen a ghost." "How very interesting," Miss Marple said. "And your shoes, Violet, are they comfortable?" I asked because I am plagued by bunions and those little heels do look trying." Violet glanced down, confused then defensive. "They're from the Jumble, miss. Nearly new. Proper good make with a metal bit in the heel so they don't wear out." "Very sensible," said Miss Marple gently. "Thank you, my dear." She left the garden with a small nod to herself. The London heel print, then, need not belong to a Londoner. Jumble sales carried cosmopolitan secrets. One only had to look under the lace. Inspector Craddock, when apprised of Miss Marple's ash-tin discovery, grew more solid than ever, and frowned as if his brow could wring out information. "P. and Comus solicitors," he muttered. "We shall ask Mr. Edmund whether the firm rings a bell. I'll have the lads sift that shed, though we've had quite enough of cinders for 1 week." He paused and added, with reluctant respect, "You do understand, Miss Marple, that the brother is pressing for an arrest. He's all for your maid friend being brought in." "I understand it very well," Miss Marple said, "and it is precisely why you must not oblige him." Craddock blew out his cheeks. "If I had only the brother's word that papers are missing." "You have rather more," Miss Marple said. "You have the fact of burning. You have the letter in the grate. You have a nervous landlady and a frightened girl, and you have, forgive me, a village full of tidy souls who will sweep away a dreadful thing not because it is false, but because it is unpleasant." Craddock stared. "And what dreadful thing would that be?" "That Mr. Henry Blackwell did not come to Marleycombe alone," Miss Marple said quietly. "He came with a past." By afternoon, the village was humming with a new thread of talk. Mr. Edmund Blackwell had installed himself at the Bluebell, where he scowled into a tumbler of whisky and demanded the police recover his brother's cheque-book. He had, too, paid a call upon Mrs. Calthorpe. Afterwards she was seen in the churchyard, white as the snow, praying rather longer than was customary. Miss Marple, who believed in the curative value of cake, called upon Mrs. Pym at the post office for a half-pound of seed cake, and inquired, as if casually, whether any registered letters had come for the old mill that week. "Registered?" "No," said Mrs. Pym. "Only the one envelope for Mr. Blackwell. Thick, good paper. The stamp was London, but smudged. Funny thing, though. We've had 2 redirected envelopes for Pemberton and Commons solicitors, both to an address in Knightsbridge. That's Pemberton with a P, mind." Miss Marple's eyes were very bright. "Do you keep the forwarding book, Mrs. Pym? The vicar is preaching on stewardship and wishes an illustration." It was not wholly untrue. The vicar always wished an illustration. Mrs. Pym, flattered, produced the book. Names and addresses marched across the page in clerkly script, and there it was. Pemberton Acosend, 47 Arundel Place, SW1, care of Mr. Henry Blackwell. Forwarding requested from an office in Holborn, dated a fortnight prior. "Dear me," said Miss Marple, "how most enlightening." On her way home, the light already thinning to grey, Miss Marple met Dr. Lanning bicycling with his scarf knotted to his chin. He dismounted, peering at her with professional curiosity. "They're all on the verge of accusing that poor maid," he said without preamble, "and Edmund Blackwell has the temper of a wasp. Still, I tell Craddock the same. There was no struggle. If it were poison, and I do not say it was subtle, and obtained by someone who knows rather more than a village maid can learn at the chemist. Digitalis, Miss Marple suggested delicately, or one of those sleeping powders one hears of? The doctor shrugged uneasy. I shall. No more when the lab confirms. There was a faint scent, not enough to swear to, but more the impression afterward. You know how one returns to a room and is certain somebody has been there? It was like that. A ghost of something acrid. Folly to speculate, he mounted again. You'll keep an eye on Mrs. Calthorpe. She looks fragile as glass. Fragile as glass. Miss Marple walked the last stretch with careful steps. She thought of glass, of the way it could be made to look like nothing at all, smooth and shining and entirely harmless, until one cut one's finger upon it. At dusk she wrote a postcard, which she did not post, and sealed it in an envelope addressed to herself. Miss Jane Marple, The Thatched Cottage, Marley Combe. It was a precaution she had learned long ago, an old-fashioned trap for a very modern habit of snooping. If someone sought to learn what she knew, they would find only that she knew it was being sought. That evening there was a small disturbance outside the Bluebell. Mr. Edmund, having fortified himself, had attempted to bully Violet in the street, accusing her in a voice that carried of spirit gum and slyness and petty theft. The girl, to her credit, did not cry. She stood very straight and said, "You don't frighten me, sir. Not you, nor the dead man neither." Only afterward, in the shadow of the churchyard yew, did she lean her forehead against the bark and tremble. Miss Marple, passing by, did not intrude. Instead she looked up at the inn window where Mr. Edmund's silhouette stalked back and forth as if counting steps. A man who wanted the talk to settle swiftly upon the easiest head. A man, perhaps, accustomed to getting his way. By 9 o'clock, Inspector Craddock called once more. He had the butter tin in his hand, sealed in a paper bag. "Pemberton and Co. Ressam," he said. "Our person co-on, I've telephoned London. They confirm they handled some property matters for Mr. Henry Blackwell. Nothing else given over the line. We'll have to go up." "Property," Miss Marple repeated gently. "How interesting. It can make men jealous, Inspector. It can make them fearful. It can make them, in certain circumstances, extremely obliging." Craddock looked at her keenly. "You think the brother did it?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that we have been invited to suspect those who serve, a very old invitation and a very poor one. But the shadow here is not the maid's. It is older, and it falls from London to Marley Combe across the years." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "I should like tomorrow to speak to the verger about his nativity donkey. He's a man of minute adjustments. Perhaps he has seen a small thing out of place." Craddock stared, then chuckled despite himself. "Very well, Miss Marple. We'll ask the donkey." "Quite," said Miss Marple. "Donkeys have a way of being present at the most important scenes." She saw the inspector out and latched her door. The hyacinth bulb on the sill sat in its glass like an egg discovered in winter, tight, patient, sure of its hour. Miss Marple wound her clock and settled her knitting in her lap. Outside, snow began again to fall, soft as feathers, and in the quiet between one tick and the next she felt, as distinctly as if someone had spoken, that the past was stirring, its footsteps light, its heel neatly repaired. Somewhere in Marley Combe, a truth long shelved, like paper in a butter tin, was beginning to smoulder. And Miss Marple, who had seen so many small smokes become a blaze, sat very still and waited for the next telltale flicker. Chapter 4. A Village of Alibis. The next morning broke in a silver frost. Marlicombe lay muffled and pale, its narrow lanes still sleeping under a hush of snow. The church bell tolled 8, and smoke rose thinly from chimneys like the sighs of an old man waking. Miss Marple had risen early, for she liked to think with her hands, and her hands this morning were busy with mending a tear in one of her linen aprons. She found it aided the mind wonderfully. A practical rhythm for sorting thoughts, she would have said. And this morning there were thoughts enough to sort. Henry Blackwell, his brother Edmund, the missing papers, the London solicitor, the frightened maid. And somewhere among these threads, a woman with repaired heels and courage on the outside. Human nature, Miss Marple murmured, never changes. One might alter the cut of the coat, but the heart beneath beats the same. At 9:30, Inspector Craddock appeared at her gate, stamping snow from his boots. He looked tired and faintly cross. "I've been up since dawn," he announced without preamble. "The brother's vanished. Gone off to London, he says, to see his solicitors. Left before I could stop him." Miss Marple poured him tea. "People who leave suddenly, Inspector, often have something they prefer not to discuss." "Indeed. But I've found something new. A telegram arrived at the post office last night, forwarded to the old mill. Mrs. Pym handed it to me this morning, sent from London 2 days before the murder." He unfolded a sheet. The message, clipped and formal, read, "Arriving Marleycombe Wednesday. Have found buyer. Keep quiet until we meet. H." Miss Marple tapped a finger on the table. H for Henry, no doubt. And to whom was it addressed? Craddock grimaced. "That's the odd bit. The envelope says only E. Calthorpe, the old mill." Miss Marple's brows rose ever so slightly. Then Mrs. Calthorpe was expecting him after all. "Seems so. She claims she never received it. Says she must have been out when the post came." Miss Marple smiled faintly. One is rarely out when one most wishes to be. By noon, the gossip was in full flourish again. The postmistress had accidentally let slip the telegram to Mrs. Pym's niece, who told the grocer's boy, who told half the village by tea-time. Mrs. Calthorpe, hounded by whisper and sympathy alike, shut herself in her parlour. Violet was said to be leaving service. To live with her aunt in Bridport, according to Mrs. Dacres, who claimed to have heard it from the milkman. At the Bluebell tea-rooms, the talk was that Mrs. Calthorpe had known Mr. Blackwell long ago, before she'd been widowed, and that he had come down to settle some old understanding. Others, more romantic, declared he was a secret lover, or even an illegitimate relation. Marleycombe was not a village to waste a mystery. Miss Marple listened quietly over her currant bun, but her eyes strayed more than once to the window where the road curved toward the church. There, trudging through the snow, was the verger, old Mr. Jessup, his cap pulled low and a determined set to his jaw. She paid her bill and followed him discreetly. Mr. Jessup was in the church, polishing the brass candlesticks with grim devotion. "Good morning, Mr. Jessup," Miss Marple said brightly. "Morning, ma'am," he replied, not looking up. "The place must be kept proper, murder or no." "Quite right," said Miss Marple. "Disorder only invites trouble. I wondered, Mr. Jessup, if you noticed anything unusual the morning of the frost fair." He paused, his cloth mid-polish. "Unusual, ma'am. There's been little else since that poor gentleman died. I meant before that, perhaps near the vicarage or the path by the old mill." Mr. Jessup frowned. "Well, now you mention it, there was something queer. Morning of the fair, I came early to light the stoves, saw a woman standing by the north gate. Blue hat, nice coat, didn't belong here. She had a paper in her hand and kept glancing toward the old mill. Then she went off down the path to the meadow. Thought no more of it till all this rumpus began." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Did you see her return?" "No, mum. And she weren't at the fair, neither. Foreign sort of hat, if you ask me. London style." Miss Marple thanked him and left him to his polishing. Outside, the snow had begun again, soft and steady. The woman in the blue hat, the letter in the grate, the ashes in the shed. A picture was forming, faint but sure, like embroidery slowly revealing itself from the back. That afternoon Miss Marple called upon Dr. Lanning. He was writing letters in his surgery, spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "I came," said Miss Marple, "to ask if you've had word from the laboratory." The doctor sighed. "Yes, confirmed my suspicion. Digitalis. Strong dose, mixed with something sugary. Probably dissolved in tea." Miss Marple nodded. "And the victim had a weak heart?" "A touch of angina, yes. The poison might have acted quickly. 10 minutes, no more. Could be disguised in a sweet taste. Clever, really. Too clever for that poor maid." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "May I ask, could such a drug be purchased easily?" Lanning shook his head. "Not now. Chemists must account for every drop, but—" He hesitated. "It's found in foxglove. Common enough in gardens." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "And Mrs. Calthorpe has a border full of it. I admired it myself last summer." The doctor frowned. "You don't suspect her?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I suspect no one, doctor. I merely notice patterns." At sunset, the village green glittered like glass. The church tower was rimmed with frost, and the first star trembled above the thatched roofs. Inspector Craddock arrived again, this time not to report, but to listen. He had learned, over years of reluctant admiration, that when Miss Marple asked to have a little word, the results were seldom trivial. She seated him near the fire and offered tea. "I believe, Inspector," she said, "that we are dealing not with passion, but with profit. The telegram, the solicitor, the property, all point to a matter of inheritance or sale. And yet there is also fear. Someone feared exposure. Exposure of what? Of something that happened long ago. You see, I made a small inquiry this afternoon. Mr. Henry Blackwell once managed property in London. For others, not for himself. There was a scandal some years back. Funds mislaid, a trust disputed, a young clerk dismissed, a lady ruined. It was never proved, but there were whispers." Craddock frowned. "And Mrs. Calthorpe? Lived in London then. Her husband worked for a solicitor's office, the very same, I suspect, that handled Mr. Blackwell's affairs. She may have known him, perhaps too well. When he came here he meant to make amends, or perhaps to use her again. The telegram suggests a bargain." The inspector leaned forward. "And the brother?" "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, "the brother. A man with temper, greed, and something to lose. Suppose Henry had evidence, a paper, perhaps, that might ruin Edmund's career. Suppose he came to Marleycombe not for peace, but to trade silence for money. Then, if someone discovered that purpose, there would indeed be motive for murder." Craddock exhaled. "It fits, almost too neatly." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "too neatly. Which is why I never trust the first picture that looks complete." That night the village slept uneasily. Somewhere an owl hooted, a dog barked once and was silent. But in the thatched cottage Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting slowly. On the table beside her lay the postcard she had addressed to herself, still unposted. She looked at it thoughtfully, then took up her pen and wrote 3 words upon the back. "Ask about the key." She replaced it in the envelope, sealed it, and smiled faintly. "One should always make a note," she said aloud, "before the next shadow falls." Outside the snow whispered against the panes. The wind carried the faint chime of the church clock, 12 slow strokes, and Marleycombe, with its secrets neatly folded beneath the frost, lay still once more. Chapter 5. A Letter from London. The morning post arrived in Marleycombe with the same dependable rhythm as the church bell, slightly late, slightly out of breath, but never absent. It was, as Miss Marple often said, the pulse of a village, and on this particular Friday that pulse brought a small envelope bearing the London postmark and a hand that spoke of education and haste. Miss Marple examined it over her breakfast tray. The handwriting was thin, nervous, and oddly familiar. She slit it carefully and drew out a single sheet. "Dear Miss Marple, forgive this intrusion, but I have reason to believe you are involved, in some manner, with the inquiry concerning the late Mr. Henry Blackwell of Marleycombe. I was once employed by his firm, Pemberton and Cumberland, and have knowledge that may be of importance. If it suits you, I shall come down on the next train to speak privately. Yours sincerely, Miss Alice Wren." Miss Marple set down her teacup, eyes thoughtful. Alice Wren. The name fluttered at the edges of memory. A typist, perhaps, or one of those efficient office women whose quiet competence often concealed deeper observation than their employers supposed. She folded the letter neatly. A woman from the past, another thread in an already tangled web. By midday the 12:10 from Paddington brought Miss Wren to Marleycombe Station. She was a thin woman of 35, plainly dressed, with anxious eyes, and hands that twisted the strap of her handbag as if to strangle her own hesitation. Miss Marple met her on the platform, the picture of gentle welcome. "Such a dreadful business," Miss Marple murmured as they walked toward the thatched cottage. "I fear you must have known Mr. Blackwell well." Miss Wren gave a short, mirthless laugh. "I knew him well enough to wish I hadn't." Inside, Miss Marple poured tea, properly hot, properly strong, and waited. Silence, she found, was often the most persuasive invitation to truth. "He was a charming man," Miss Wren began, voice low. "Too charming. Women trusted him. Men feared him. He worked for Pemberton and Co. as a partner, though the firm handled many private matters, estates, inheritances, that sort of thing. He knew where everyone's secrets were kept." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "And he kept a few of his own, perhaps?" Miss Wren nodded. "There was a case 2 years ago, the Harkness Trust. Money missing, documents altered. Mr. Blackwell took the blame, but it wasn't all his doing. Someone else profited, and I believe that someone was his brother." "Edmund," said Miss Marple, not as a question. Yes, Edmund had connections. He persuaded Henry to take the fall quietly, promised him a share of some property sale later on, but that sale never happened. I think Henry came to Marleycombe to demand his due. Or his revenge, Miss Marple murmured. Miss Wren swallowed hard. He wrote to me a week before he left London, said he'd found proof, something in writing. He meant to confront Edmund privately, said he was meeting an old friend to make arrangements. That must have been Mrs. Calthorpe. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her tone remained mild. You know her? I've never met her, said Miss Wren, but I typed her name often enough. She used to correspond with the firm years ago, when her husband managed small legal accounts. I think she knew too much. Mr. Blackwell once called her our inconvenient conscience. Inspector Craddock arrived that afternoon, summoned by note. He greeted Miss Wren with the polite stiffness of a man uncertain whether he was about to receive a witness or a nuisance. I'd better warn you, he said, that anything you tell us may go on record. Miss Wren nodded gravely. That's why I came. As she recounted her story, Craddock's brows drew together in concentration. When she finished, he sat back with a sigh. So, to sum up, the brothers quarrelled over money. Mrs. Calthorpe was involved in the pass business, and now we've a dead man poisoned in her guest room. I'll say this, Miss Marple, you do attract the interesting sort. Miss Marple smiled faintly. One doesn't attract them, Inspector. One merely notices when they arrive, Craddock grunted. The question is, who knew Henry had that proof? If Edmund found out, there's motive enough. But he's in London now, and we've nothing to tie him to the village at the time of death. Miss Wren hesitated. May I speak plainly, Inspector? By all means. Edmund would never dirty his hands with the act itself. He'd use someone loyal, or frightened. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Fear and loyalty often share a bed, don't they, my dear? The following day brought another twist. The postman delivered a brown envelope to the police station. No return address, the writing disguised in block capitals. Inside lay a single key on a piece of twine and a scrap of paper with 3 words. Try the attic trunk. Craddock wasted no time. That afternoon, accompanied by Miss Marple and Mrs. Calthorpe, looking pale but composed, he unlocked the small attic room of the old mill. Dust motes swam in the weak light. In one corner stood an old leather trunk. The lock clicked, and Craddock lifted the lid. Inside were a few blankets, a tin box, and a packet of letters tied with a faded ribbon. He unfolded one. The handwriting was Henry Blackwell's. Dearest E., I'm tired of concealments. If you do not honour our agreement, I shall be forced to tell the truth. About the trust, about your part, and about what happened to poor Harold. The papers are safe until we meet. H. Craddock exhaled sharply. E for Edmund. There it is in black and white. Miss Marple, peering gently over his shoulder, said nothing. She was looking instead at the tin box. It was light, but not empty. She opened it and drew out several pages of typed correspondence. Letters between Mrs. Calthorpe's late husband and the firm of Pemberton and Cumberst, discussing the handling of the Harkness Trust. Mrs. Calthorpe, pale as parchment, swayed slightly. I knew nothing of this. My husband said it was all settled years ago. Miss Marple placed a steadying hand on her arm. My dear, I believe you, but someone did not wish the past to stay buried. That evening, after the official bustle had quieted, Miss Marple sat once more by her fire. Miss Wren had returned to London on the evening train, promising to send any remaining documents she could find. Inspector Craddock was filing his reports, muttering about warrants and motive. But Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She turned over in her mind the brown envelope, the anonymous note, the key. The act of sending it bespoke guilt, or conscience. Someone close enough to the scene to know of the trunk, but too afraid to speak openly. Not Edmund, she mused aloud. He would destroy evidence, not reveal it. Mrs. Calthorpe would never risk her own ruin. Miss Wren is in London, and Violet. Her knitting paused mid-row. Ah, Violet. The maid had left that morning for Bridport, or so the gossip claimed. Yet the milkman, she recalled, had mentioned seeing her at dusk near the station, talking earnestly to a stranger in a dark overcoat. Miss Marple smiled slightly. The younger generation does so love melodrama, but sometimes even melodrama conceals courage. She reached for her notebook and wrote, Key sent anonymously, Likely Violet. Knows more than she dares tell. Must be found before Edmund returns. The clock struck 10. Snow was falling again, soft and persistent, covering the footprints on the lane, as if the village, weary of its own secrets, longed for silence. But Miss Marple, who understood that silence often shouted loudest of all, took up her shawl and blew out the lamp. "Tomorrow," she murmured, "I shall go to Bridport." Chapter 6. The Girl Who Ran Away. The next day dawned with a timid sun, filtering through pale clouds and mist that clung low over Marleycombe. The snow had softened overnight, leaving glistening rivulets along the hedgerows and muddy edges on the lanes. Trains ran slow that morning. The guard at the station declared the line to Bridport temperamental, which Miss Marple, wrapped neatly in grey tweed and carrying her worn carpet bag, received with patient good humour. "One must never hurry the British railway system," she told him pleasantly. "It resents the attention." The 9:42 train to Bridport chugged into motion with a weary sigh, and Miss Marple settled herself in a corner seat, knitting on her lap and thought for company, across. From her sat a soldier on leave, snoring faintly. Beside him, a mother with a fretful child. The countryside drifted past in slow procession, hedges, meadows and cottages half lost in mist. As she travelled, Miss Marple reviewed what she knew. Henry Blackwell had been poisoned, of that there was now little doubt. His brother Edmund had motive, greed and fear. Mrs. Calthorpe had connection, the past, and perhaps a letter meant for her. Violet had opportunity. She was there, she served the tea, she heard the knock, but motive? No, unless someone she loved had been threatened. And then there was the anonymous key sent with the words, "Try the attic trunk." Miss Marple could think of only one person humble enough to fear the police yet brave enough to help them. Violet had run away, yes, but perhaps not to escape. Bridport was a small coastal town, wind-blown and respectable, with rows of shops that smelled of salt and furniture polish. The landlady of the modest boarding house on East Street looked startled when Miss Marple inquired for Violet. "Why, yes," she said slowly. "Young Violet Turner, quiet girl, came in yesterday evening. Paid for 2 nights. She's gone out just now. Said she had an errand at the post office." Miss Marple thanked her and went that way herself. The post office in Bridport was a busy place, all wooden counters and clattering stamps. Violet stood at the far end, clutching an envelope, her eyes darting toward the door. When she saw Miss Marple, she started visibly, her hand halfway to the letter slot. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't expect—" "My dear," said Miss Marple kindly, "I rather thought you might not." Violet's fingers trembled. "I'm not running away, not really. I had to think." Miss Marple guided her to a bench by the window. "Thinking is best done before tea, never after. I'll buy us both a cup, and you shall tell me exactly what you meant to post." For a moment Violet looked as though she might bolt, but something in Miss Marple's quiet gaze, the kind firmness of it, undid her. She handed over the envelope. It was addressed in careful handwriting to Inspector Craddock, Marleycombe Police Station. Miss Marple turned it gently. "May I?" The girl nodded miserably. Inside was a short letter, written in pencil on cheap paper. "Sir, I didn't mean for any harm to come. I only did what I was told. The tea wasn't meant for him. I swear it wasn't. He said it would just make her sleep a little. Please forgive me. Violet Turner." Miss Marple folded the letter, slid it back into its envelope, and sighed softly. "My dear, start at the beginning. Who is he?" Tears welled up. "Mr. Edmund, the brother. He came one evening before the fair. Said he'd come down early, quiet-like. He knew Mrs. Calthorpe wasn't at home. She was at choir practice. And he waited outside till I opened the kitchen door. He was angry. Said his brother had come to ruin him. Told me to put something in a cup of tea just to make him drowsy, he said. He gave me a little paper packet. Said if I didn't, Mrs. Calthorpe would lose her place, the house, everything. I didn't want to, Miss Marple, but he frightened me so. And you obeyed. Yes. Only I got muddled. There were 2 cups on the tray. I thought the left-hand one was hers. I swear I did. But when I came back," her voice broke, "he was dead, and Mr. Edmund was gone. He came back the next day bold as brass, pretending it was the first he'd heard." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on the girl's arm. "My dear, you've done a very brave thing. Fear makes fools of the strong and heroes of the frightened. You must come back to Marleycombe with me at once." "But they'll say I killed him." "They may," said Miss Marple calmly, "but truth has an odd way of standing up for itself, even when it's late to the party." They reached Marleycombe by evening. The village seemed to hold its breath as word spread that Violet had returned, escorted by Miss Marple and the constable. Mrs. Calthorpe wept when she saw the girl, clinging to her as though to a daughter. Inspector Craddock heard the full story in grim silence. When Violet had finished, he rubbed his chin and said heavily, "That's motive enough to hang Edmund if we can prove it." "We can," said Miss Marple quietly. "He made a single mistake. He trusted human nature to behave like a clock." Craddock blinked. "And it doesn't. Not in Marleycombe," she said. "Or anywhere, for that matter." She turned to Violet. "When Mr. Edmund gave you the powder, did he handle the cups himself?" "No, ma'am, but he pointed. Said, 'That's hers, the left one.'" "Ah." Miss Marple nodded. "And you placed the tray on the right-hand side of the table, did you not? Facing the bed?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then his left would be her right," she smiled faintly. "Perspective, Inspector. The downfall of many clever criminals." Craddock's eyes widened. "Good Lord, he poisoned the wrong cup himself." "Quite." Within 2 days, the affair was over. Edmund Blackwell, confronted with Violet's confession and the recovered letters from the trunk, could no longer bluff his way out. A warrant was issued. He was found at a hotel near Paddington, attempting to book passage abroad. The London papers made much of it. "Society man arrested in brother's murder. Village sleuth exposes sinister plot." Miss Marple, seeing her name spelled Maple in the Daily Chronicle, only smiled and went on with her knitting. On Christmas Eve, Marleycombe glowed once more with soft light and cautious cheer. The church bells rang for evening service, and the villagers, even those who had whispered the worst, came out with a kind of embarrassed goodwill. Mrs. Calthorpe, pale but composed, had reopened the old mill, vowing to turn it into a proper tea-house. Violet, absolved and newly confident, helped her, serving cakes with the calm pride of one who has walked through fire and come out clean. Inspector Craddock paid a final call before the service. "I thought I'd bring you the last bit of news," he said, settling his hat awkwardly. "They've got Edmund's full confession. Said he only meant to make his brother ill, force him to sign some papers. Claimed he didn't realise the powder was pure digitalis. Still, he admitted to everything else." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "Confessions are seldom complete, Inspector, but they do serve the purpose," he smiled. "I'll say this, Miss Marple, you've an eye sharper than half my men. How do you manage it?" "Observation, my dear Inspector, and memory. People do repeat themselves endlessly, you know. Only the setting changes." She poured him tea. "Sugar," he chuckled. "Not from a stranger, thank you." That night, after the carols and the candlelight, Miss Marple walked home through the hush of snow. The stars glittered coldly above, and the air smelt of pine and frost and peace. The sort of peace one never quite trusts but is grateful for while it lasts. At her cottage gate she paused, looking back at the lamplight spilling from the church windows. "Christmas," she murmured, "always finds the truth out, sooner or later." Inside, she lit her fire, fed her cat, and took up her knitting once again. On the mantelpiece lay the now famous brown envelope, the one with the key, kept as a reminder that courage sometimes comes wrapped in fear. The clock struck midnight. Miss Marple smiled, counted her stitches, and whispered to the empty room, "Poor Violet, she'll be all right now. As for the Blackwells, well, every family has its own nativity, some born of hope, some of guilt." Outside, Marleycombe slept under its white blanket. The church bell tolled softly over the roofs, and the snow began once more to fall, slow, silent, and pure. Chapter 7. The Christmas Gathering. Christmas morning in Marleycombe dawned clear and bright, a miracle of sunlight after so many days of snow and shadow. Frost still traced the window panes, and icicles glittered like crystal daggers along the eaves, but the air had lost its bite. Church bells chimed from St. Michael's warm and merry, as though to assure the village that all sins had been duly accounted for. Miss Marple, who had seen enough winters to mistrust sudden sunshine, nevertheless opened her curtains with quiet satisfaction. "The village," she observed to her cat, "is at peace again, at least until the next scandal." She had spent the night rereading letters, her own, not the late Mr. Blackwell's, and thinking of the curious nature of human gratitude. Inspector Craddock had sent her a polite note of thanks with a single line scrawled beneath. "Without you, the Wrong person would have hung. She thought it rather touching, though unnecessary. Truth, she knew, had no need of medals, but there were still small matters unsettled, the way there always are when crimes are tidied too quickly. So, when the vicar's wife invited her to a Christmas luncheon for company and cheer, Miss Marple accepted, though she had a faint suspicion that more than mince pies awaited her. The vicarage was already full when she arrived. Villagers, flowers, and the faint chaos of festivity. Mrs. Weatherby, all flutter and lace, greeted her warmly. "My dear Miss Marple, you've saved us all from infamy. Poor Violet, poor Mrs. Calthorpe. How do you bear such things with such calm?" "Hot tea and good knitting," said Miss Marple mildly. "One finds them most sustaining." The guests assembled in the drawing-room. The Calthorpes, Violet, Dr. Lanning, Mrs. Pym, and even Inspector Craddock, coaxed there by the vicar's insistence that no man should eat alone at Christmas. The table was long and bright, the turkey enormous, and the talk, for once, polite. But beneath it all, Miss Marple sensed something unresolved, a faint tremor beneath the surface calm. It was Mrs. Calthorpe who broke it. "Miss Marple," she said suddenly, voice trembling, "I cannot rest easy, even now. Why did he come back here? Why this house? He could have met me anywhere." The room fell still. Craddock set down his glass. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "Because, my dear, he wished to remind you of something, and to use your trust for his own ends." Mrs. Calthorpe's eyes widened. "You mean the property?" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "The old mill once belonged to the Harkness Trust, did it not?" Mrs. Calthorpe nodded slowly. "My husband bought it cheaply, after the trust was dissolved. I never thought—" "That," Miss Marple said, "was the point. Mr. Blackwell helped arrange the sale, diverting the proceeds. He assumed it would remain forgotten. But when your husband died, his name on the deed made the property a loose thread in a very frayed piece of cloth. Henry feared discovery, and later, when fortune turned, he sought to use it again, this time as leverage against his brother." Dr. Lanning leaned forward. "Then the old mill was part of their scheme all along?" "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "A convenient hiding place for both their past and their papers. Henry kept a copy of every incriminating document. Clever men often do. He stored them here once, long ago. Returning to Marleycombe was, for him, merely reclaiming what he thought was owed." "And Edmund," murmured Craddock, "decided to settle the account permanently." Miss Marple nodded. "Though one must give him credit. He was tidy about it." Violet shivered. "It doesn't feel tidy, miss. It feels sad, like he'd planned it all, but forgot we was people." Miss Marple smiled, gently. "They usually do, my dear." After luncheon, when the others had drifted toward the drawing-room and the vicar began the first hesitant notes of Good King Wenceslas, Inspector Craddock lingered near Miss Marple. "You're not telling me everything," he said in a low voice. "Of course not," said Miss Marple cheerfully. "That would be quite dull." He waited. She sipped her tea, eyes distant. "There is one matter," she said at last, "that still troubles me. The brown envelope with the key, the one sent anonymously." Craddock nodded. "You still think it wasn't Violet?" "Oh, she posted it, yes. But it wasn't her idea. The handwriting on the label. You compared it with Edmund's, I presume?" "We did." "Didn't match." "No," said Miss Marple, "but it matched something else. The label on the packet of digitalis the doctor found missing last summer. The same slant, the same capital T. I took the liberty of asking Mrs. Pym for her records." Craddock stared. "You mean—" "Dr. Lanning's handwriting, Inspector," he froze. "But he's the one who called the poison?" "Precisely. A little too conveniently, don't you think? I wondered why the exact compound had not been identified sooner. A doctor who handles such drugs knows their trace well. And then, of course, there was his friendship with Edmund. Old-school acquaintances, were they not?" Craddock rubbed his temples. "Good Lord, Miss Marple, are you saying Lanning helped him?" "I am saying," she replied softly, "that a frightened man often seeks another's help, and a clever man gives it in such a way that only guilt remains with the dead." She smiled faintly. "But it's Christmas, Inspector, and Dr. Lanning has already received a letter from London, inviting him to explain certain discrepancies in his supply records. I doubt we shall see him again." Craddock exhaled. "You've thought of everything," Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Not everything, my dear. Only the small things. It's the small things that tell the truth." By evening, the vicar's house emptied. Mrs. Calthorpe and Violet went home arm in arm. Mrs. Pym stayed behind to help with the washing up. as much to gossip as to serve, and the inspector trudged out into the cold, promising himself a quiet week for once. Miss Marple walked home alone beneath a sky clear and hard as crystal. Her breath steamed in the air and her footprints crackled in the frost. As she passed the old mill, a light glowed faintly in the parlour window. Mrs. Calthorpe reading to Violet, perhaps. A peaceful sight, if one didn't know how close that house had come to ruin. At her gate she paused, gazing at the stars. Somewhere a nightingale began to sing, uncertainly, as if spring had been promised early. Miss Marple smiled. People, she murmured, are very much alike. They make the same mistakes, tell the same lies, and yet, somehow... They go on being kind, she went inside. The fire was burning low, the kettle murmuring softly. She settled into her chair, her knitting on her lap. On the mantel lay the Christmas card Mrs. Calthorpe had given her that afternoon. A simple image of holly and snow with a handwritten note inside. For saving not only our lives but our hearts. Miss Marple read it once more, her eyes softening. Dear soul, she said aloud. If only people understood how seldom one saves anyone. One merely reminds them that they can save themselves. The clock struck 11. Marleycombe lay quiet beneath its frosted roofs, the last carols fading into night. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly in rhythm with the ticking clock, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Murder, she said to the empty room, is rather like embroidery. One must look from the back first, only then can one see how the threads truly cross. Outside, snow began to fall again, light, silent, forgiving, and in the little village of Marleycombe, peace, fragile but genuine, settled at last. Chapter 8. The Return of Miss Wren. 2 days after Christmas, when the wreaths had begun to wilt and the church bells rested from their labours, Marleycombe was visited by a sharp wind and an unexpected visitor. Miss Jane Marple, taking tea with Mrs. Pym at the post office, first heard the news from the horse's mouth, or rather from the postmistress's niece, who came bursting through the door with the excitement of a herald. There's a London lady just come down from the station, auntie. Looks ever so smart. Asked the way to Miss Marple's cottage, she did. Miss Marple looked up mildly. Did she indeed? A London lady, you say? Yes, miss. Travelling case and all. Said her name was Wren. Miss Marple's smile deepened. Ah, then the wind brings what it promised. She excused herself with her usual grace, leaving Mrs. Pym and her niece to dissect the information to death before luncheon. Miss Alice Wren arrived at the thatched cottage just as the church clock struck 11. The train had brought her through fields still powdered with snow, and her cheeks were bright from the cold. She looked tired, and yet there was a composure about her, now that Miss Marple had not seen before. "My dear Miss Wren," said Miss Marple warmly, "you are most welcome. I rather wondered if I might see you again." "I'm afraid this isn't merely a social call," said Miss Wren, unbuttoning her gloves with trembling fingers. "Something new has come to light, something I thought you ought to see before the police." Miss Marple poured tea without hurry. "The police will have it soon enough, I dare say. But perhaps it would be pleasanter to tell me first." Miss Wren handed over a thin envelope worn at the corners. Inside lay 3 sheets of typewritten paper, the ink faint but legible. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. "To whom it may concern," the first page began, "I, Henry Blackwell, being in my full senses, though not, I think, much time remaining, hereby record the truth of the Harkness Trust affair. My brother Edmund was the architect of that fraud, and I his accomplice. We diverted funds meant for the education of war orphans into private accounts. For years he kept me silent through promises and threats. I can no longer bear it. This statement, together with supporting documents, I leave in the keeping of a person who knows my conscience better than I do myself. When she sees fit, she will send it where it belongs." Miss Marple lowered the page. "He wrote this before coming to Marleycombe, of course." "Yes," said Miss Wren. "He gave it to me to post, in case he didn't return. But I couldn't bring myself to do it then. I thought it melodrama. Only after the papers spoke of his death did I realise what he'd meant." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at the fire. "And now you have come to deliver it," Miss Wren nodded. "To you, because I think he meant you when he said, 'A person who knows my conscience better than I do myself.' He must have remembered you, Miss Marple. He told me once about a woman in St. Mary Mead who saw everything and missed nothing." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Men have long memories for women who notice too much. They sat quietly a while, the fire crackling, the clock ticking companionably. Then Miss Marple said, "There is something that still troubles you, Miss Wren." The younger woman hesitated. "Yes, I can't help wondering, did he really deserve to die? He was guilty, yes, but perhaps he might have redeemed himself. It feels so unfinished." Miss Marple sipped her tea. Redemption rarely arrives at a convenient time. Mr. Blackwell may have meant to make amends, but the habit of deceit, my dear, is like brandy. One doesn't give it up easily. But if he truly meant to confess, then fate was kinder to him than to those who live long enough to repeat their sins, said Miss Marple gently. A clean ending is sometimes the most merciful one. Miss Wren sighed. "I suppose you're right. Still, I thought you should have the letter. I'll take it to Inspector Craddock afterward." "Do," said Miss Marple. "He will appreciate your honesty, and I dare say Scotland Yard will too." In the afternoon, Inspector Craddock came himself, stamping snow from his boots, and looking very pleased with the world. "You've heard, no doubt," he said, accepting tea. "We've had a confession from London. Dr. Lanning, the clever gentleman himself, wrote to the Home Office, admits he supplied Edmund Blackwell with the drug, claims he was blackmailed, of course." Miss Marple nodded. "That fits rather neatly." "Neatly enough," said Craddock, "but here's the curious part. Edmund denies any knowledge of it, says Lanning acted on his own, hoping to curry favour. The pair of them are blaming one another so efficiently it's almost a Christmas pantomime." "How human," murmured Miss Marple. "There is nothing men love more than sharing sin, provided they can divide it unevenly," Craddock chuckled. "You'll be glad to know, at least, that your Miss Wren's evidence closes the case entirely. That letter she brought, it'll hang Edmund without trouble." "Poor man," said Miss Marple. "He never did understand the difference between cleverness and wisdom." That evening, Marleycomb's Christmas festivities resumed their normal course. The frost melted from the eaves, the children returned to skating on the pond, and the old mill's windows glowed cheerfully with lamplight. Mrs. Calthorpe and Violet hosted a small gathering for the neighbours, and Miss Marple, though not fond of crowds, made an appearance for courtesy's sake. The room was bright with holly and laughter. The vicar told a mildly alarming story about the choir boy's pudding, and Mrs. Pym declared that peace had at last returned to Marleycombe. Miss Marple smiled and said she quite agreed, though she doubted peace was ever more than a visitor. Later, as she stepped outside, the air was crisp and starlit. Snow crunched beneath her sensible shoes. Beside her, Violet stood in the doorway, face upturned to the night. "It's quiet now, isn't it, miss?" she said softly. "Proper quiet, like it's all been forgiven." Miss Marple smiled. "Forgiveness, my dear, is seldom quiet, but it does, in the end, make less noise than guilt." Violet frowned slightly, trying to puzzle that out. Miss Marple gave her hand a brief squeeze. "You've done very well, Violet. Don't look back too much. People who spend their lives doing that tend to trip over the present." "Yes, miss. I'll remember." When Miss Marple returned home, she placed Henry Blackwell's final letter in her writing desk, sealing it with a neat note for Inspector Craddock to collect in the morning. Then she stood at the window, looking out across the darkened village. In the distance, the bell of St. Michael's struck 9. Each chime seemed softer than the last, as though the whole of Marleycombe were exhaling at last. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is a curious thing," she said to the quiet room, "how wickedness often begins in the pursuit of something quite good. Comfort, ambition, even love, and how rarely the wicked understand that it ends not in tragedy, but in tidiness." She closed the curtains, turned down the lamp, and went to bed. Her cat curled at her feet, purring like the echo of contentment. Outside, snow began once more to fall, gently this time, forgivingly, covering the graves, the roofs, and the secrets of Marleycombe in one soft, immaculate sheet. Chapter 9. The Final Testament. 3 mornings after Christmas, Miss Marple was interrupted during her usual breakfast of toast and marmalade by an unexpected knock at the door. It was a courteous, deliberate sound, not the eager tapping of neighbours bringing gossip, nor the brisk authority of Inspector Craddock. It had the rhythm of someone who both knew their manners and expected to be admitted. When she opened the door, she found a gentleman standing there, tall, grey-haired, wearing a dark overcoat that had once been expensive and was now simply serviceable. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm and a courteous expression upon his thin face. "Miss Jane Marple?" he asked. "That is so," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Do come in out of the cold." He stepped inside, removing his hat with a small bow. "My name is Howard Penrith, of Pemberton and Cubbion Solicitors. I believe you may be acquainted with certain matters concerning the late Mr. Henry Blackwell." Miss Marple gestured toward the hearth. "Indeed I am, Mr. Penrith. You must forgive me for not offering congratulations on your firm's continued survival, given recent revelations." Penrith gave a thin, rueful smile. "We are, I assure you, thoroughly ashamed and thoroughly relieved. We've been assisting Scotland Yard in sorting through Mr. Blackwell's private papers. It seems he left behind quite a tangle, but also unexpectedly a will, and it concerns you, Miss Marple." "Me?" she repeated, setting down her teacup. "Good heavens." He opened his portfolio and drew out a single folded document. It was executed 2 months before his death, witnessed by one of our clerks. It appoints you executor of his personal effects, along with a modest bequest for your services to truth. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. "That sounds most undeserved." "On the contrary," said Penrith gravely, "he also left a sealed envelope addressed to you. We were instructed to deliver it after the conclusion of any legal proceedings. Given that Mr. Edmund Blackwell is now otherwise occupied," he cleared his throat, "we believe the time appropriate." He handed her a thick envelope. It was sealed with old-fashioned red wax bearing the imprint of an ornate bee. Miss Marple took it thoughtfully. "I should perhaps read this in private," she said. "Would you like some tea while I do so?" "Thank you, no," said Penrith. "I must return to London this afternoon. But if I may, I will leave a card, should you require assistance." "I rarely do," said Miss Marple with a kind smile, "but I shall keep it none the less." When he was gone, Miss Marple placed the envelope upon the table and regarded it as one might a sleeping snake. Then, with deliberate neatness, she slit the seal with her letter opener. Inside were 2 sheets of paper, both written in Henry Blackwell's firm, elegant hand. "To Miss Jane Marple. When last I heard your name, it was in connection with a small matter at St. Mary Mead, something to do with poison and a church fete. You will not remember me, but I remember you. We met once at luncheon in London through a mutual acquaintance, a lady whose secrets you kept far better than I did. I am a man who has done harm. It is not confession I seek, only precision. The law will take care of guilt. But I have often wondered what becomes of truth after the law has finished with it. Does it die quietly or does it persist? I have left behind in the care of your local vicar a small parcel. In it are 2 letters and a cheque. The cheque is for you, to dispose of as you see fit. The letters concern Violet Turner and Mrs. Calthorpe. They will not alter what has happened, but they may lighten 2 hearts. You once said, at that luncheon, that evil is seldom dramatic, that it begins in small untidiness of thought. You were right. Mine began with a single careless kindness. Tell them that if they think of me, they may remember that once, perhaps, I meant to do good. Yours faithfully, Henry Blackwell. Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it slowly. A curious man, she murmured. But even snakes shed their skins when the time comes. At midday she walked to the vicarage. The snow had hardened overnight. It cracked underfoot like thin ice. The vicar received her warmly in his book-lined study, and upon hearing her errand, went at once to a locked drawer. "Indeed, Miss Marple," he said, producing a small brown parcel, "Mr. Blackwell left this with me early in December. He said it contained some private papers for safekeeping. I confess I rather forgot it amid the excitement." "Quite understandable," said Miss Marple. The parcel contained 2 sealed envelopes and a cheque for £200, an astonishing sum. She slipped the cheque into her handbag and examined the envelopes. One bore the name Mrs. E. Calthorpe, the other Violet Turner. She did not open them. Instead, she carried them herself to the old mill that same afternoon. Mrs. Calthorpe received her in the parlour. The fire was crackling, and Violet, in a neat apron, was trimming a vase of holly. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "I have brought you something that was left in trust for you by Mr. Henry Blackwell." Mrs. Calthorpe blanched. "For me?" "Yes." Miss Marple placed the envelope in her hand. "And one for Violet." Violet stared. "Oh, miss, I don't want nothing of his." "Nevertheless, my dear, I think you should have it." The 2 women sat side by side and opened their letters. Mrs. Calthorpe's hands trembled. Violet's lips moved silently as she read. Neither spoke for several minutes. Then Violet looked up, eyes bright with tears. He says he's sorry, that he never meant to frighten me, that he told his brother I was brave. Oh, miss, he didn't hate me after all." Mrs. Calthorpe, dabbing her eyes, said softly, "And mine. Mine says he forgives me for staying silent all those years, that my husband was not to blame, that he remembers I once told him truth comes like spring, whether one wants it or not." Miss Marple smiled gently. "He was wiser in death than in life, I think. Men sometimes are." She rose. "Now, my dears, I will leave you. You have both been given what most never receive, the chance to close a door without bitterness. Make good use of it." As she turned to go, Violet caught her hand. "Miss Marple, if ever you need help, proper help, I'll come. I don't know much, but I can listen." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "My dear child, that is precisely what the world needs most." That evening Marleycombe seemed to exhale a final sigh. The scandal had run its course. The papers ceased to mention it. The villagers found new subjects for conversation. The old mill thrived as a tea-house. The vicar preached a sermon on repentance and the blessings of snow. Inspector Craddock was promoted to chief inspector, though he swore it was entirely against his will, and Miss Marple, in her quiet cottage, wrote a single letter to a solicitor in London. "Sir, I enclose a cheque from the estate of Mr. Henry Blackwell. Kindly distribute the amount between the Marleycombe Orphans Fund and the Church Roof Restoration Appeal. I believe Mr. Blackwell would have preferred it thus. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple." When she sealed it, she sat back and smiled. "It is remarkable," she said to her cat, "how very much evil money can accomplish once it has repented of itself." The clock ticked softly. The fire burned low, and outside Marleycombe lay bathed in silver light, peaceful, quiet, and whole again. Chapter 10. The Curtain Falls. At Marleycombe. January settled upon Marleycombe like an old quilt, heavy, frayed and comfortable. The village had returned to its gentle rhythm of small errands and smaller intrigues. The frost still clung to hedges, the smoke curled sleepily from chimneys, and the church bell resumed its weekly duty of chiding the tardy to worship. For the first time in months the talk had turned from death to more cheerful matters. Mrs. Pym was planning to repaint her shop sign. The vicar was composing a sermon on domestic peace. Even the postman had stopped glancing over his shoulder when delivering letters to the old mill. Miss Marple, however, never quite trusted peace. "It is like cream on milk," she told her cat. "It floats for a time, but one mustn't forget what lies beneath." She spent the morning rearranging her rose cuttings and mending a small tear in her wool shawl when another knock came at her door. This one was hesitant, almost apologetic. "Come in," she called, expecting the vicar's wife or perhaps Violet with some new recipe to test. Instead, a man entered, middle-aged, stocky, hat in hand. His boots were muddy, his coat well worn but clean. There was something uneasy yet honest in the way he stood, as though the act of knocking had cost him dearly. "Beg pardon, miss," he began, voice low. "Name's Harold Calthorpe. I was Mrs. Calthorpe's husband." Miss Marple looked up from her sewing unstartled. "How interesting. We had all thought you dead." He gave a faint, weary smile. "So did I for a while." She poured him tea, for confessions, she always said, were best accompanied by a cup. Mr. Calthorpe, alive and unexpectedly humble, told his story in the slow, halting way of a man long unaccustomed to speech. "I went abroad after the war," he said. "Work was scarce here. Got into trouble in Africa, business trouble, not crime. Lost my papers, my ship went down off Tangier. Thought it best to stay gone till I could make it right. Wrote to Evelyn, that's the missus, but the letters came back marked unknown. When I finally scraped the fare home, I found she'd sold the place and started that bed and breakfast. I thought, well, she'd done better without me. Didn't want to shame her." Miss Marple nodded gently. "So you stayed away?" "Yes, till I read in the Chronicle about the murder. That name, Henry Blackwell, gave me a turn. I knew him, you see, years ago, when I was clerk to Pemberton and Co." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "Indeed?" "Aye. He was charming, clever. Talked me into helping him with the Harkness accounts. I didn't understand half of it. Thought it all above board. When it went wrong, he told me to keep quiet, said he'd see me right later. But the firm dismissed me. Evelyn never knew the truth. I went to sea after that." He stared into his cup. "I read he died here. Poisoned. I suppose it was justice of a sort, but I couldn't leave her thinking me dead, not now. Miss Marple's voice was very soft. Does she know you've come? He shook his head. No, I was hoping you'd advise me. I don't want to hurt her again. If she's happier without me, I'll go quietly. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. My dear Mr. Calthorpe, I have observed that women seldom welcome the return of men they have properly buried, unless, of course, they still love them, in which case the years matter very little. Shall we find out which sort of woman your wife is? They walked together to the old mill. The sky was pale blue, the air bright and sharp. Smoke rose from the chimney. Through the frosted windows they saw Violet setting out tea trays for guests. When Mrs. Calthorpe came to the door, her face drained of colour. For a moment she simply stared, and then, with a soft cry, she clasped her hands and whispered, Harold. What followed was quiet, awkward, and oddly touching. There were tears, yes, but also laughter, the kind that comes when grief, long carried, suddenly sets itself down. Violet, hovering at the doorway, dabbed her eyes. It's like something out of the pictures, she murmured. Only nicer. Miss Marple smiled, faintly. Real happiness is seldom as tidy as cinema, my dear. When she left them, husband and wife were seated side by side before the fire, talking in the low, conspiratorial tones of people rediscovering the comfort of shared memory. That evening Inspector Craddock appeared, again. He had, Miss Marple reflected, become almost as regular as the post. I've had the oddest telegram, he said, brandishing it. From your solicitor friend in London. Seems a new confession's come to light. From Henry Blackwell himself. Another? Craddock nodded. Apparently he wrote to his brother a few days before his death, saying he'd decided to turn over new evidence to the authorities. But here's the curious part. The letter was never sent. It was found tucked behind a portrait in the solicitor's office. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. And what does it say? Craddock read aloud. Dear Edmund, by the time you receive this, you will know I have made my peace. The matter of the trust will soon be public. I do not write for forgiveness, but to tell you that the deed you fear most is not mine to reveal. She has kept it all these years. You should thank her, though I doubt you will. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ah, that would be Mrs. Calthorpe. She kept the letters all along, the ones her husband gave her before he vanished. She told me she had destroyed them, but she hadn't. She merely hid them, perhaps even from herself. Craddock blinked. So that's what Edmund feared, the real evidence. Indeed, said Miss Marple, and yet the irony remains. It was the one person he never suspected who held his ruin in her hands. Craddock sighed. You really do see everything, don't you? Not everything, she said, only what people try hardest to hide. The next Sunday, Marleycombe gathered for the New Year's service. Snow had melted from the church roof and water dripped like silver from the eaves. The pews were full, the air scented with evergreens. Mrs. Calthorpe and her husband sat together in quiet contentment. Violet beamed beside them, hat askew. Even the vicar, noting Miss Marple's presence, seemed to deliver his sermon with an extra note of gratitude. Afterward, outside in the pale sunlight, villagers exchanged greetings and good wishes. Craddock, looking almost cheerful for once, shook Miss Marple's hand. Well, that's it, he said. Case closed, everyone happy, justice done. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Justice, perhaps. Happiness is rather a larger project. He laughed. You'll never admit a story can end neatly, will you? My dear Inspector, she said, life doesn't. Why should stories? That evening she sat once more in her parlour, writing a final note in her small, tidy hand. Private notes on the Marleycombe case. The guilty, Edmund Blackwell, executed justice. Dr. Lanning, self-condemned. The innocent, Violet Turner, redeemed by courage. Mrs. Calthorpe, forgiven by time. Henry Blackwell, redeemed by remorse. The unexpected, Harold Calthorpe returned. Providence's final jest. Moral. In every crime, there is a moment of choice. Seldom grand, often domestic. Evil begins with the failure to wash one's conscience as carefully as one's teacup. She closed the notebook, placed it in her desk and drew the curtains. Outside, Marleycombe glowed faintly under the moon. Somewhere down the lane the sound of laughter drifted from the old mill, not loud but warm and human. Miss Marple smiled, folded her hands in her lap and said quietly, So ends another tale, until the next cup of tea, I suppose. The clock struck 10. The kettle began to sing, and in the still, forgiving night, Marleycombe slept, its secrets at last content to rest beneath the snow. Chapter 11. The Mirror in the Parlour. January 6th, 12th night, dawned grey and mild, the kind of English day that can't decide whether it's winter or spring. Thin mist lingered over the meadows, and the air smelled faintly of thawing earth. Marleycombe, having survived its adventure with murder, was already sliding back into its familiar comfort of gossip, puddings, and parish meetings. Miss Marple sat by her parlour window with her needlework spread across her lap. She was repairing a torn cushion cover that Violet had brought over from the old mill. "Nothing fancy, just old chintz, miss, but I can't bear to throw it away." The little act of mending suited Miss Marple's mood perfectly. It was what one did after life had come apart at the seams. The cottage was quiet, save for the tick of the mantel clock and the distant bleating of sheep on the hill. The newspaper lay folded on the table beside her. She had read the front page already. Edmund Blackwell convicted. Dr. Lanning struck off, and found no pleasure in it. Justice Satisfied was rarely pleasant to look upon. "Evil," she murmured, "is most often a matter of untidy housekeeping. Moral housekeeping, that is." She had just threaded her needle when a knock sounded at the door. Firm, polite, and unmistakably metropolitan. "Come in," she called. The door opened to reveal a young woman wrapped in a dark travelling coat, her hair tucked beneath a neat felt hat. There was a briskness to her, but also the tentative air of someone uncertain how she would be received. "Miss Marple?" "Yes, my dear. And you are?" "Clara Wren, Miss Alice Wren's niece." Miss Marple rose at once, pleased and surprised. She remembered Alice Wren, the brave typist who had carried Henry Blackwell's confession from London, and had thought fondly of her ever since. "Do sit down, Miss Wren. I trust your aunt is well," Clara hesitated. "She passed away last month, I'm afraid. She'd been ill for some time, but before she died, she asked me to bring you something." She reached into her handbag and produced a small square parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with blue string. Miss Marple accepted it gently, reading the label written in Alice's careful type. "For Miss Jane Marple, to be delivered when the truth in Marleycombe has settled." "Your aunt was precise to the end," said Miss Marple with a sad little smile. "Will you take some tea? It's a long way from London." "Yes, thank you." Over tea and currant buns, Clara told her story. Alice Wren had never quite recovered from the scandal surrounding the Blackwell brothers. She had left the firm of Pemberton & Co. and joined a charitable office dealing with missing persons. It had been, Clara said, her way of making amends. She'd spoken often of Miss Marple. Whenever something puzzled her, she'd say, "Aunt Jane would find the sense in it. She made you sound like an angel of order." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "I doubt very much that angels have the patience for parish life, my dear." When the tea things were cleared, she opened the parcel. Inside lay a small, ornate hand mirror. Silver, a little tarnished, with initials engraved on the back, H.B., and beneath it, a folded note in Alice's unmistakable type. "My dear Miss Marple, I found this among Henry Blackwell's effects when his estate was settled. It seemed of no value to the solicitors, but I could not bring myself to throw it away. He once told me it had belonged to a woman who saw too clearly. I think he meant you, though he never said so outright. If ever you find yourself doubting the usefulness of seeing, perhaps the mirror will remind you that reflection, properly applied, brings light, not vanity. Alice Wren." Miss Marple turned the mirror over in her hands. The silver was worn, but the surface still caught the light cleanly. For a moment she saw her own lined face framed within it, pale eyes, calm mouth, an expression both amused and weary. "A woman who saw too clearly," she said softly. Perhaps he wasn't altogether wrong. Clara watched curiously. Was Mr. Blackwell truly so wicked? Miss Marple set the mirror down. "Wickedness, my dear, is seldom pure. He was selfish, clever, and afraid. Fear makes more villains than hatred ever did." Clara nodded thoughtfully. "My aunt said you believe everyone's capable of good, if they only remember what it looks like." "Your aunt was too generous," Miss Marple said, "but I do believe most people are capable of remembering. They simply prefer not to be reminded." When Clara had gone, the cottage grew quiet again. Outside, the afternoon light dulled to pewter. A robin perched on the windowsill, pecking at the crumbs Miss Marple had left there. She sat with the mirror on her lap, thinking of the curious way life tied its knots, sometimes tight, sometimes loose, but always in the end forming a pattern. Her mind drifted to Marleycombe, Mrs. Calthorpe and her husband, now contented, Violet managing the tea house with pride, Inspector Craddock who sent her postcards from his new post in Exeter. Even the vicar seemed more cheerful, though his sermons were no shorter for it. Yes, the village had healed, but not forgotten, and that, she reflected, was how it should be. Forgetting was merely sweeping dust under the rug, remembering kept one honest. At 4:30, the church bell tolled the hour. Miss Marple rose, set the mirror on the mantel and straightened the frame photograph beside it, a faded picture of her younger self among a garden club, smiling faintly in the summer sun. A mirror and a memory, she said aloud, both unforgiving, both indispensable. The next morning brought a letter, thick and official-looking, bearing the crest of the Royal Society for the Study of Criminology. Inside was a neatly typed invitation. "Dear Miss Marple, your assistance in several recent investigations has come to the attention of our committee. We are hosting a spring conference on the psychology of the ordinary criminal at Bath this March. We would be honoured if you would attend as a guest, or even speak informally on the subject of intuition in detection. Yours sincerely, Professor Arthur C. Fane." Miss Marple laughed outright. "The psychology of the ordinary criminal? Why, that's simply the psychology of everyone at a jumble sale." Still, the idea intrigued her. Bath was not far, and hadn't she once promised herself a little holiday when the Marleycombe business was done? She laid the letter beside the mirror, the silver catching the weak sunlight like a wink. "Very well," she said to the cat. "We shall go to Bath, and I dare say there will be something dreadful to tidy up there too." The cat yawned in agreement. That evening she wrote a short note to Inspector Craddock. "My dear Inspector, I find myself invited to Bath this spring to attend a criminology gathering. I am uncertain what I might contribute, but I confess the prospect of observing so many experts discussing ordinary crime fills me with affectionate amusement. Should anything of interest occur, you shall of course be informed, after I have had my tea. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple." She sealed it, placed it on the hall table for the post, and stood once more before the mantelpiece. The mirror reflected her small figure, the tidy room, the quiet satisfaction of a mind at peace. "A woman who sees too clearly," she murmured again, "must sometimes close her eyes, but only long enough to rest." She extinguished the lamp. Outside, the moon rose pale over the frozen fields. Somewhere a train whistled faintly, perhaps the very one that would carry her to Bath in the spring, to another polite gathering, another puzzle. Miss Marple smiled to herself, folded her hands and whispered, "The curtain falls, for now." And in the gentle hush of Marleycombe, the mirror on the mantel caught the firelight once more and reflected it back, steady, unwavering, like truth itself. Chapter 12. The Case of the Criminology Conference. By the time March arrived, Marleycombe's hedgerows were bursting with snowdrops and the faintest blush of green. Winter had retreated without ceremony, leaving muddy lanes and the sweet promise of spring. Miss Marple's cottage had undergone its own quiet awakening. The curtains were laundered, the hearth scrubbed, and her travel trunk, a sensible brown leather affair that had seen more destinations than most tourists, stood neatly by the door. "Bath," she told her cat, "is not so far as the Holy Land, but one must still prepare for sin." The cat blinked, unimpressed. She was to take the morning train to Bath to attend the Royal Society for the Study of Criminology's spring conference, a curious gathering of retired colonels, earnest professors, and the occasional policeman. The invitation, though flattering, amused her greatly. "The psychology of crime," she'd said to Mrs. Weatherby, "is rather like the psychology of knitting. It's all a matter of counting and missing loops." Nevertheless, she was looking forward to it. The assembly at the Royal Crescent Hotel was everything Miss Marple had imagined, and a little more besides. The great Georgian ballroom had been transformed into a lecture hall with rows of stiff chairs, and the air smelled of chalk, furniture polish, and self-importance. At the dais stood Professor Arthur Fane, a tall, gaunt man with spectacles and the sort of moustache that trembled when he disapproved. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "we are here to consider the moral temperament of the criminal mind, its development, expression, and perhaps its cure." Miss Marple, sitting discreetly near the back, murmured to her neighbour, One might think we were at a sanatorium for sinners. Her neighbour, a brisk woman in a navy hat, turned out to be Mrs. Letitia Grant, a retired headmistress from Surrey. "You're Miss Marple, aren't you?" she whispered. "The lady from that Marleycombe business? Oh, I followed it in the Chronicle. Quite marvellous." Miss Marple smiled politely. "The credit belongs mostly to Inspector Craddock, and to human nature, which never changes." Mrs. Grant laughed. "Then you'll enjoy this company. They're all quite convinced they can change it." The lectures were long and earnest. A Colonel Bostock spoke on discipline and delinquency, waving his stick for emphasis. A Dr. Herridge from Oxford presented a paper titled The Genetic Root of Wickedness, which Miss Marple privately considered nonsense in Latin. But it was the afternoon panel that truly caught her attention. The case of the unsolved theft at the Crescent Museum. Professor Fane himself presided, joined by Dr. Herridge, Colonel Bostock, and a young man with an air of restless energy, Mr. Leonard Miles, curator of the museum. As Miles described the affair, a missing Roman cameo worth several £1,000s, Miss Marple noted the audience leaning forward in delight. It was, after all, a real unsolved crime in their midst. The theft had occurred a fortnight earlier, between 5 and 6 in the evening during a private viewing. Only 5 people had access to the display room: Mr. Miles, a visiting scholar named Dr. Pennington, the housekeeper Mrs. Wick, a junior attendant, and a young secretary, Miss Evelyn Drake. The police had searched thoroughly, but neither culprit nor cameo had been found. "Perhaps," said Professor Fane solemnly, "our distinguished guests might offer some theories." A murmur ran through the crowd. Miss Marple, unnoticed, took up her knitting. Mrs. Grant nudged her. "Go on, Miss Marple. You've solved murders. Surely you can manage a trinket." "Oh, I never solve anything," Miss Marple said modestly. "Things simply make sense when one listens properly." During the break for tea, Miss Marple found herself near the refreshment table beside the young curator, Mr. Miles. He was nervous, fiddling with his teaspoon. "Such a pity," Miss Marple said kindly. "About your cameo. It must be dreadful to lose something so valuable," he sighed. "Not just valuable, unique. And now everyone thinks it was one of us. Dr. Pennington swears he's innocent, and Mrs. Wick is beyond reproach. That leaves Miss Drake, but she's been with us for years." "She must be quite devoted," Miss Marple observed. "She is. That's what troubles me," he frowned. "She's clever too. Frightfully clever. I can't imagine her making such a clumsy theft." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "it wasn't clumsy at all." Later that evening, after the final paper had been read, and the professors had congratulated themselves into exhaustion, Miss Marple retired to her small but comfortable room. She sat at the dressing table, brushing her hair, and reflected on the curious case of the missing cameo. Something about the details nagged at her: the hour, the witnesses, the locked display case. She reached for her notebook. Facts. Theft between 5 to 6 p.m. 5 people with access. Display locked, no forced entry. Miss Drake, secretary, prepared tea trays that afternoon. Housekeeper dusted cabinets earlier that day. She smiled slightly. "Ah," she murmured, "tea trays again. It's always tea." The next morning, Miss Marple rose early and walked to the Crescent Museum. Her invitation to the conference lent her just enough authority to request a brief look at the exhibit room. Mr. Miles, still anxious, escorted her. The cabinets were locked again, the shelves neat and bare. Only a few Roman vases and coins remained. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the empty velvet stand where the cameo had once rested. "Was the glass polished recently?" she asked. "Mrs. Wick does it every Thursday." "And the day of the theft?" he nodded. "Yes, that very morning." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And Miss Drake prepared the tea for the visiting scholars, I believe?" "Yes. Why?" "Oh, only that people tend to carry more than they realise when they tidy up." By noon, the museum was in mild uproar. At Miss Marple's quiet suggestion, Mr. Miles had requested permission to examine the teapot used during the viewing. Beneath the lid, folded into the hollow handle, which had been recently repaired, lay the missing cameo wrapped in a scrap of lace. Miss Drake, confessed almost at once. She had hidden the jewel to protect it, or so she claimed, from Dr. Pennington, who she believed meant to steal it himself. But her intent to return it later had conveniently coincided with her plan to leave Bath for Paris the following day. Professor Fane, suitably impressed, called it an inspired deduction. Miss Marple demurred. Not deduction, Professor, merely experience. Wherever there is tea, there is truth. That evening, as the conference guests toasted her cleverness, she slipped away to the hotel lounge. The fire burned low, rain whispered against the windows. She took from her handbag the small silver mirror Alice Wren had left her and set it beside her teacup. In its reflection she saw the flicker of firelight, the genteel faces beyond, and her own calm eyes watching them all. People, she said softly to herself, do not change, only the circumstances in which they misbehave. She smiled, closed her notebook, and ordered another pot of tea. Outside, Bath slept beneath its lamps and rain. Inside, Miss Marple, warm and serene, sat waiting for whatever small wickedness the next day might bring. Chapter 13. Murder at the Crescent Hotel. Rain beat softly on the curved windows of the Royal Crescent Hotel, tracing silver veins down the glass. The criminology conference had reached its final evening, a gala dinner to celebrate the close of an intellectually fruitful symposium, as Professor Fane had described it with pompous delight. Miss Marple, never one for late suppers, had intended to slip away early to her room, but Mrs. Grant, that irrepressible ex-head mistress, had insisted. "My dear, you simply must attend. They're serving trout and papillote, and there's talk of a surprise toast from the Dean of Bath himself." So Miss Marple, impeccably tidy and soft grey, found herself among 100 scholars, policemen, and retired military men dining beneath the glittering chandeliers. The room hummed with talk, debates on motive and morality, theories of reform, even speculation about Miss Marple's cameo triumph at the museum. Professor Fane presided grandly, flanked by Dr. Herridge and Colonel Bostock. At the far end sat Mr. Leonard Miles, looking more cheerful than she had seen him yet, and beside him Mrs. Grant, who was attempting to convert him to the benefits of punctuality. Miss Marple herself sat near the centre of the long table, with a young constable on one side and a small nervous man on the other. Dr. Pennington, the visiting scholar who had once been suspected of the cameo theft. He was pale, sweating slightly, and drank too much claret for comfort. "Quite a relief," he muttered, "having my name cleared, though I don't suppose one ever really recovers from suspicion." "Truth," said Miss Marple kindly, "is like washing. It's never quite finished, but it keeps things decent." He gave a strangled laugh and returned to his wine. The dinner progressed agreeably until dessert, a magnificent plum pudding carried in with brandy flames. As it was served, Professor Fane rose for his closing address. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have discussed crime in all its forms, moral, social, psychological. We have learned, I hope, that wickedness is not confined to the dark alley, but may dwell equally in the drawing-room." He broke off suddenly, swaying slightly. A murmur ran through the guests. His hand went to his throat. Then, with a sound like a stifled cough, he collapsed across the table. China shattered. Someone screamed. The Dean dropped his napkin. Miss Marple alone remained seated, her eyes fixed calmly on the fallen man. "Please," she said clearly, "and no one move the plate." But her warning came too late. Colonel Bostock had already snatched it up, calling for air and water. The professor's face was purple. The brandy flame still danced on the pudding beside him. Within moments, the doctor present pronounced the obvious. "Dead," he said grimly. "Sudden cardiac failure. Or poison." Half an hour later, the dining room had become a scene of chaos. The guests were gathered in shocked groups. Waiters whispered in corners. Inspector Craddock, summoned by sheer providence, for he had arrived that afternoon to attend the closing session, was already on the scene, brisk and competent. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, joining her near the sideboard, "I suppose you couldn't resist arranging another murder for me?" "On the contrary, Inspector," she replied serenely. "I much prefer them unscheduled." Craddock bent over the professor's glass. "Doctor says he smelt bitter almonds. Cyanide, most likely. Nasty business." "And his plate?" "Removed before I got here, blast it. Some fool took it to the kitchen." Miss Marple sighed. "Human instinct, Inspector. Tidy up before asking why." By midnight, the police had taken statements. Everyone had eaten the same menu, save for the professor, who had insisted on an additional glass of white wine. "That was served by one of the hotel staff," Craddock said, frowning at his notebook. "A new waiter. French accent, they say, though no one quite remembers his face. Disappeared the moment the commotion began." "Curious," murmured Miss Marple. "And yet, I think we may find our French waiter rather closer to home." Craddock looked up sharply. "You've seen something?" Only what one always sees, Inspector. Manners. The Professor's, for instance. He was most particular about his table setting. I noticed he changed glasses with Dr. Herridge just before the pudding arrived." Craddock whistled softly. "Deliberately?" "Oh yes," he said. "I detest the taste of this claret. Yours looks better, old man." And they swapped without comment. Such little social deceits always lead to tragedy. The next morning Bath buzzed with the scandal. Professor Deers at Criminology Conference read the headlines, which, as Miss Marple remarked, was a phrase that would sell papers indefinitely. Inspector Craddock spent the day interrogating the panellists. Dr. Herridge protested innocence. Colonel Bostock blustered about foreign trickery. Mr. Miles seemed genuinely horrified. By evening nothing had been proved, except that the poisoned glass had indeed contained cyanide mixed with wine. Miss Marple found Craddock pacing the hotel lounge, chewing his pencil. "This case is a maze," he muttered. Everyone had reason to dislike the Professor. He was vain, arrogant, half of them owed him money, and yet none of them had opportunity. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, but opportunity, like beauty, is often a matter of reflection." He stared. "Reflection? Yes, Inspector. You'll recall that the hotel staff placed a long mirror behind the high table to make the room appear larger." Craddock frowned. "Yes. What of it?" The Professor was seated facing it. He could see every movement behind him, including, I imagine, the hand that reached toward his glass. Realization dawned slowly. "So you think he wasn't the intended victim?" "Precisely. The poison was meant for Dr. Herridge. The switch of glasses merely hastened poetic justice. That evening the police found proof enough. Among Dr. Herridge's belongings was a packet of cyanide tablets, prescribed under another name. Confronted, he broke down entirely. Yes, I meant to kill him," he cried. "He'd stolen my research, mocked me before the society. But it was his wine, not mine. Curse him, he took the wrong glass." Craddock sighed heavily. "There's a moral in that somewhere." "There usually is," said Miss Marple. The next morning Bath returned to its usual tranquillity. Polite, elegant, and ever so slightly indifferent to tragedy. Miss Marple, having given her statement, packed her trunk. Inspector Craddock came to see her off at the station. "You do realise," he said, "that you've now solved 2 crimes before breakfast." "Breakfast," she said, "is the only sensible time for observation. People are still themselves then," he smiled. "And what will you do now?" "Go home," said Miss Marple, "and prune my roses. There's been quite enough human nature for one season." The train whistle blew. She stepped aboard, settled into her seat and watched the countryside slide by. Green fields, white sheep, a sky washed clean of all deceit. "Reflection," she murmured, gazing at her small silver mirror in the lamplight. "It does rather show everything, doesn't it? The truth and the wrinkles alike." She smiled, folded her hands, and closed her eyes. The train carried her gently back toward Marley Combe, toward tea, tranquillity, and whatever small wickedness awaited its turn beneath the English sun. Chapter 14. The Return to Marley Combe. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple's train pulled into the small, tidy station at Marleycombe. The countryside, washed green by March rain, gleamed like a freshly polished teacup. The air smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and distant lilac. The events of Bath already seemed like another world, a world of claret, professors, and poisoned egos. Miss Marple stepped down onto the platform with her neat travelling bag and umbrella, greeted the porter with a kind word, and set off along the lane toward her cottage. The sky was soft and blue-grey, the fields dotted with lambs. She felt the pleasant satisfaction of returning to the familiar, to her rose beds, her clock, and her kettle that never quite boiled quietly. As she approached her gate, however, she stopped short. There was something hanging from the latch, a small square of paper pinned beneath a sprig of ivy. The note, written in shaky pencil, read, "Gone away sudden. Don't worry, miss. Back soon. Tea Price." Miss Marple frowned slightly. Thomas Price was her gardener, a quiet man of 50 with the shy manners of a church mouse. He had tended her patch for nearly 8 years, never once missing a Monday. He was also, she reflected, almost illiterate. The handwriting, though clumsy, was too deliberate, too tidy. "Gone away sudden," she murmured, rereading the words. "No one who truly leaves in a hurry takes the time to find ivy for decoration." Inside, the cottage was immaculate. The neighbour, Mrs. Weatherby, had clearly been keeping an eye on it. The air smelled faintly of polish and lavender, yet Miss Marple felt an odd stillness, as though something in the rhythm of her home had faltered. She unpacked her trunk methodically, made tea, and sat by the window with her knitting. Outside, the garden lay quiet beneath the lowering sky. The beds were well turned, the early tulips pushing through. Everything looked in perfect order, which to Miss Marple was itself suspicious. Order, she mused, is like innocence. The more perfect it appears, the more certain one is that something's been swept under the rug. The next morning she walked down to the post office. Mrs. Pym greeted her with delight. "Miss Marple? Back from Bath, are you? We've all been following the conference business. Fancy them. Having a murder there. Though, of course, if you were involved, it's not surprising." "I assure you," Miss Marple said mildly, "it was most inconvenient. Has anything happened here while I was away?" "Nothing much, dear, except that Price fellow of yours disappearing. His sister came round asking after him 2 days ago, said she hadn't heard a word, and now she's gone to stay with her daughter in Yeovil till he turns up." "I see," said Miss Marple. "And he left no word with anyone?" "Only that note on your gate, I suppose," said Mrs. Pym. "But that's funny. He never writes, does he? Always comes in person." Miss Marple nodded. "Quite." By noon she'd visited the vicarage, the old mill and the blacksmith's. No one had seen Thomas Price since Wednesday. His small cottage at the edge of the village was locked. The milk on the step had soured. But inside, visible through the curtain, Miss Marple noticed something odd. A chair overturned, and a spade propped unnaturally against the mantel. Later that afternoon, Inspector Craddock arrived, summoned by her quiet but unmistakable note. "I'd hoped for at least a month's peace," he said, half smiling as he joined her in the garden. "Peace, Inspector," said Miss Marple, "is not the same as silence. In this case, I believe we have the latter." She handed him the note. He read it, whistled softly and turned it over. "Pencil from a carpenter's box, paper from a grocer's ledger. Not something your gardener would use. You're right. He didn't write this. I thought as much. And if you'll look here—" She pointed to the soil near the back fence. 2 sets of footprints, one small, sharp, feminine, the other larger, heavy and recent. The smaller set ended abruptly near the lilac bush, where a patch of earth had been freshly disturbed. Craddock crouched. "Good Lord! You think—" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that someone came calling after dark." The constable and a spade soon confirmed her suspicion. Beneath the soft earth lay a bundle wrapped in sacking. It was not the gardener himself, as Craddock first feared, but a bag of tools, neatly cleaned, wiped of all prints. Beneath them, however, was a letter sealed in oilcloth. It was addressed simply, "To Miss Jane Marple, in case I don't come back." Craddock handed it to her silently. She unfolded the note with calm precision. The handwriting was unmistakable. Thomas Price's clumsy scrawl this time, no mistake. "Dear Miss, if anything happens, it's because of that man from the city, the one asking about your roses last week. I didn't like his look. Said he was from London and wanted to buy bulbs, but he asked too much about you, when you'd be home and such. I followed him down the lane and saw him turn into the old quarry path. If I don't come back, you'll know where to look. Your servant, T. Price." Craddock's face hardened. "So someone was watching your house?" "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly, "and we might surmise they expected me to be absent longer." By dusk the search had spread to the quarry woods, a narrow overgrown path leading to the disused stone pits east of the village. The place was silent except for the wind whispering through birch trees. The constable's lantern swept across the ground and caught the glint of metal, a pocket knife engraved with initials. Craddock picked it up. "H.P. Harold Price?" "No," said Miss Marple softly. "Henry Pemberton." Craddock stared. "The solicitor? But he's dead. Heart failure last year." Miss Marple's eyes shone faintly in the lantern light. "Indeed. Yet his name has reappeared rather often of late, in connection with the Blackwell case, the trust papers, and that final confession. You'll recall that one Henry Pemberton was once senior partner to both Edmund Blackwell and Dr. Lanning," Craddock exhaled. "You think this is connected to Marleycombe again?" "My dear Inspector," said Miss Marple, "in my experience, evil seldom travels alone. It leaves family behind." That night, the body of Thomas Price was found at the bottom of the quarry pit, half buried beneath stones. The coroner would later record accidental fall, but Miss Marple and Craddock exchanged a look that required no words. Back at the cottage, she sat before the fire reading his letter again. That man from the city... Her eyes narrowed. The man from the city has always been the beginning of trouble. She took out her notebook and wrote a single line beneath the heading, "The Quarry Affair." Find the heir of Henry Pemberton. Then she closed it firmly and stirred the fire. Outside, the March wind rose in the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and secrets stirring once more. "So," she said to the flames, "it seems Marleycombe hasn't finished telling its story." And in the stillness that followed, the church bell tolled 8, each chime deep and deliberate, like the ticking of a mystery just beginning again. Chapter 15. The Man from the City. 2 days after Thomas Price was found in the quarry, Marleycombe's calm veneer cracked once more. The villagers, though fond of gossip, were not fond of fear, and the talk now was of strange footsteps at night, of a lantern seen moving near the churchyard, of the London man who had come asking questions about Miss Marple. Miss Marple herself was unusually brisk that morning. She had spent the dawn hours in her parlour, her spectacles perched on the end of her nose, reviewing a bundle of old correspondence. The faint smell of smoke from the hearth mingled with the sharper tang of ink and paper. When Inspector Craddock arrived, unshaven, bleary, and very much resigned to whatever she might have uncovered, he found her ready with tea, scones, and an unnervingly neat dossier. "Good morning, Inspector," she said cheerfully. "You'll be pleased to know that I've made some inquiries." He groaned softly. "When you say inquiries, Miss Marple, I generally find that someone's about to be arrested, and not necessarily by me." She ignored the remark and passed him a page covered in tidy handwriting. "I believe," she said, "that the man who came to see my gardener was not new to Marleycombe at all. His description matches a Mr. Reginald Pemberton, lately of London, the nephew and heir of Henry Pemberton, solicitor, and formerly connected with the Blackwell Trust." Craddock frowned. "Pemberton again! That family's like a weed you can't pull up." "Quite so. Young Reginald was mentioned in Henry's will. He inherited the remaining business papers after the firm's dissolution. Those papers, you'll recall, concerned the same trust that ruined both Edmund Blackwell and poor Henry himself." "Go on," said Craddock, sipping tea with the fatalistic air of a man accepting his doom. "Well," Miss Marple continued, "I imagine that young Pemberton, finding the papers useless, may have been persuaded by someone that they contained more than they did, or perhaps he believed they might lead to hidden funds. The sort of romantic nonsense men of weak character adore. You think he came here to look for money? Possibly, or to silence anyone who might know where it had gone." She looked up. "You see, Inspector, I remember Henry Blackwell's final letter, the one to his brother. It mentioned, 'The deed you fear most is not mine to reveal.' He referred, I think, to the fraudulent land deeds from that same trust. If Reginald found them among his uncle's papers, he may have thought to turn them into cash." Craddock tapped his pencil. "Then your gardener stumbled across him, and... yes, and ended at the bottom of the quarry for his trouble." That afternoon, they visited the late Henry Pemberton's former office, a narrow building on the High Street, now shuttered and dusty. Its new tenant, a pawnbroker, was only too happy to let them examine the old back room. The air smelled of paper and damp. Old account books lined the shelves. Miss Marple moved slowly, studying the dust like a detective reading a diary. Craddock pulled open a drawer and swore softly. Inside lay several letters bearing a familiar letterhead: Pemberton and Cobusters, solicitors. One was addressed to Mr. Reginald Pemberton, at a London address in Kensington. The handwriting was unmistakably Henry's. "Listen to this," Craddock read aloud. "Reginald, I implore you to destroy the old trust papers. They are cursed things. I have burnt my copies. There is nothing but ruin in them. Do not be tempted to use them. They are false from the first signature to the last." Miss Marple nodded slowly. So Henry tried to end it, but his nephew saw only opportunity. And that opportunity led. "Him here," said Craddock grimly. Back in Marleycombe, the lanes glistened with late rain. The villagers were shuttering their windows early. Word had spread that the constables were searching the quarry woods again. Miss Marple, however, preferred to search elsewhere, in mines rather than mud. She paid a quiet call on Mrs. Calthorpe at the old mill. The widow, no longer lonely now that her husband had returned, greeted her warmly. "My dear Miss Marple, you look as though you've been walking through trouble. "In a sense I have," Miss Marple said. "Tell me, when Mr. Blackwell lodged here last December, did he ever mention the name Pemberton?" Mrs. Calthorpe frowned in thought. "Once, perhaps. He said something about old Pemberton keeping the key. I thought it meant a safe deposit, but he might have meant something else." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly. "Perhaps he meant it quite literally." She glanced toward the mantel where an old brass key still hung from its ribbon. Mrs. Calthorpe followed her gaze. "That one? It's only for the cellar. At least that's what I was told. May I?" "Of course." The two women descended the narrow steps into the cool stone cellar. The air was thick with the smell of apples and dust. Miss Marple's lantern beam fell upon a small wooden chest beneath the wine rack. Its lock matched the key perfectly. Inside lay several rolled documents, bound with red tape. She unfastened one, revealing a map marked Harkness Trust Land, 1938. At the bottom, in faded ink, were 3 signatures: Henry Pemberton, Edmund Blackwell, and Harold Calthorpe. Mrs. Calthorpe gasped. "My husband's name!" "Yes, my dear," said Miss Marple gently. "He was clerk to Pemberton's firm. It seems he witnessed the original fraud, perhaps unwittingly. And when Henry Blackwell died, these documents should have been destroyed. But someone hid them here instead. Perhaps Henry himself, or perhaps your husband, intending to make things right some day. And that man, the one who killed poor Thomas, came to find them." "Precisely." By dawn the next morning, the hunt for Reginald Pemberton had reached London. Craddock wired Scotland Yard with the findings. Miss Marple, though weary, sat writing in her parlour, the stolen deeds neatly bundled beside her teacup. It was nearly 10 o'clock when a shadow darkened her window. She looked up, and there, standing beyond the glass, was a man's face. Thin, pale, damp with rain. He knocked once. "Mr. Pemberton, I presume," she said quietly. The door creaked open. "You've got something of mine, madam." His voice was smooth, almost polite. "I think," said Miss Marple, "you mean something of your uncle's, and even he didn't deserve it." He took a step forward, gloved hand reaching inside his coat, but before he could draw whatever lay there, the firm tread of boots sounded on the path. "Inspector." Craddock appeared in the doorway behind him. "Good evening, Mr. Pemberton. I wouldn't—" The man froze. The struggle lasted only a moment, then he was handcuffed, scowling, and seated in Miss Marple's chair. "You meddling old witch," he spat. "If you'd stayed in Bath—" Miss Marple looked mildly offended. "My dear young man, one cannot go about the world leaving loose ends. They catch in one's knitting." Later, when the police car carried Reginald Pemberton away, Miss Marple returned to her tea. The clock chimed softly. She allowed herself one sigh, not of triumph, but of resignation. "Every crime," she said to the empty room, "begins with an untidy thought and ends with an untidy man." She picked up her knitting again, her needles clicking softly in time with the ticking clock. Outside, the spring rain eased, and the world, for now, seemed orderly once more. Chapter 14. The Return to Marleycombe. The 9:10 from Bath rattled its way through the damp Somerset countryside, carrying with it a single, small figure seated neatly by the window. Miss Marple had taken her accustomed place facing forward. She disliked travelling backwards on principle, and occupied the journey with her knitting, her tea-flask, and the quiet business of thought. Bath had been instructive, even stimulating, but she felt now the tug of home like a needle finding its thread. Marleycombe, she reflected, was not the sort of place that welcomed prolonged absence. Villages, like households, went untidy when left alone. And I dare say, she murmured to herself, someone has been dusting where they oughtn't. When the train at last slowed beside the little station, the smell of coal smoke and wet grass rose through the open door. She stepped out, the porter doffing his cap, and there it was again. The hill, the church spire, the cluster of cottages folded together like an old quilt. She felt, as she always did, that curious mixture of affection and foreboding. Her cottage looked precisely as she had left it, or very nearly. The latch was fastened, the curtains drawn evenly, the small pots of winter pansies still blooming valiantly by the front path, but on the gate hung a note, pinned neatly beneath a sprig of ivy. "Gone up London for a few days, miss. Don't fret. T.P." Miss Marple stood looking at it for several moments. Thomas Price, her gardener, was a man of few words and fewer adventures. He seldom went farther than Yeovil. Moreover, the spelling was too good. The fret was most unlike him. She removed the note, folded it carefully, and went inside. The house was spotless. Too spotless. A bowl of roses, beginning to droop, sat on the table. She hadn't left those. The clock had been wound. Even the ash in the grate had been neatly brushed aside. Someone, she thought, had been here. Someone conscientious, but unfamiliar. "There's devotion," she said softly, "and then there's tidying up after the wrong person." The next morning she walked down to the post office, her sensible shoes splashing through puddles. Mrs. Pym greeted her eagerly from behind the counter. "Back from Bath, are you? We've all read about that poor professor. Never a quiet moment with you about, Miss Marple." "I do my best," said Miss Marple mildly. "Has anything occurred while I was away?" "Well, your man Price has done a bunk, hasn't he? His sister was here fretting something dreadful. Said he'd not been home 3 nights. But he left word for you, didn't he? That little note on the gate." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Most thoughtful. Only it's a queer thing. He's never written me a letter in his life, that one. Always pops in if there's business. Can't abide pencils, says they scratch wrong." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "And has anyone new been about the village?" Mrs. Pym pursed her lips. "Now you mention it. There was a stranger asking directions. A tall gentleman, coat all city style, said he was looking for the old mill. Claimed he'd come to see about purchasing rare bulbs, but between ourselves I think he was no more a gardener than I'm a duchess." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I dare say you'd make a far more honest duchess, Mrs. Pym." By afternoon, Inspector Craddock had been persuaded down from Yeovil. He arrived mud-splashed and irritable, but Miss Marple knew the signs of relief beneath his scowl. "Another mystery, is it?" he said, standing in her doorway. "You do have a way of keeping me from my paperwork." "I should hate to interfere with official efficiency," said Miss Marple sweetly. "However, I think this is more serious than a missing gardener." She handed him the note. He studied it, frowning. "Ledger paper," he said. "Notepaper ruled for accounts. And this hand, steady, practised. Someone imitating poor Price's clumsy scrawl." "Quite," said Miss Marple. "And there's another matter, the prints by the lilac bush. 2 sets, one large, heavy-booted, one smaller, light-soled. Both fresh after last night's rain." Craddock's eyes sharpened. "You've been out there already, haven't you?" "I dislike waiting," she said mildly. "You'll find, if you look, that someone's dug under the roots. There's a patch of earth just a shade too smooth." They went to see. The inspector knelt and turned the soil with his penknife. Beneath, wrapped in sacking, was a gardener's spade and gloves, carefully cleaned, too carefully. Beneath those, a tin box, dented and old. Inside were scraps of paper, some burned, some whole. On one corner was the faint letterhead, "Pemberton and Cambio, solicitors." Craddock swore under his breath. "Them again." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "Like bindweed, they grow back wherever truth has been planted." At dusk the constable returned from searching Price's cottage. "No sign of him, sir," he reported. "Front door locked, but the back was open a crack. Place looked turned over proper, and there's blood on the hearth." Craddock looked grim. "Then we'll search the quarry." Miss Marple said nothing. She merely folded her hands and stared into the darkening garden. When the body was found the next morning, at the bottom of the old stone pit, she was not surprised. The coroner would later call it an accident, but the villagers knew better. That evening Miss Marple sat by her fire, the tin box before her on the table. From it she drew the least damaged paper and smoothed it gently. Transfer of title. Harkness Trust Holdings, 1938. The signatures were faint but legible. Henry Pemberton, Edmund Blackwell, and Harold Calthorpe. "So," she murmured, "the ghosts gather again." She understood now what had drawn the stranger back to Marley Combe. These papers were the last surviving link in that long chain of deceit, the fraudulent deeds that had ruined men and sent others to their graves. Somewhere in London, someone had learned of their existence, someone who believed they were worth killing for. She took up her pen and wrote to Inspector Craddock. "My dear Inspector, if you wish to save yourself a great deal of digging, I suggest you inquire into the affairs of Mr. Reginald Pemberton, late of Kensington. He is the nephew and sole heir of the solicitor who once handled the Harkness Trust. He may be able to tell us why my gardener had to die. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple. When she sealed the letter, the clock struck 9. The sound was unusually clear, echoing through the quiet house. Outside, the rain had ceased. A single star gleamed above the church spire. Miss Marple sat back, hands folded in her lap. So it begins again, she said softly, and perhaps, at last, it will end. Chapter 16. The Secrets Beneath the Lilac. The rain had washed Marleycombe clean, but Miss Marple knew the village was only apparently rinsed of its troubles. Mud dries, motive clings. She rose early, watered her hyacinth with the dainty restraint of someone who has never drowned a plant, and placed on her hall table a postcard she had written in a thin schoolroom hand. To Inspector Craddock. Second bundle of deeds found. Will retain until you call. J.M. She left the stamp unlicked and the address unfinished, then set the card half-tucked beneath the brass letterweight on the hall table, where any dutiful friend, or any curious intruder, might notice it. Miss Marple believed in good locks, better neighbours, and best of all the old village habit of just looking in. The guilty shared that habit with the innocent, only their hands shook more. By 9:30 she had called at the post office for thread and stamps. Mrs. Pym, bright as a robin, leaned over the counter. "Terrible business with your poor gardener, Miss Marple. Have they caught the murderer?" "The police have made progress, Miss Marple said mildly. "And where is your niece this morning?" "Hilda? Oh, she's about—" Went to fetch an inventory pad from the storeroom. "We do go through those pages." "Yes," said Miss Marple, selecting a packet of needles. "Ledger paper is the backbone of civilization." She paid, made a remark about the damp, and went out slowly, as if nothing else in the world interested her but the weather and the price of stamps. Then she did a curious thing. She walked once around the green, stopped to admire the new cobbled drain beside the church wall, and turned back towards her cottage by a different lane, which brought her to the rear hedge rather than the front gate. Miss Marple disliked melodrama, but she believed in vantage. A figure was already at her front door, a young woman in a sensible coat and hat glancing left and right with the flutter of someone both eager and uncertain. Hilda Pym let herself in with a key from beneath the mat, the village idea of secrecy, and closed the door behind her. Miss Marple waited 3 minutes, enough time to be indiscreet, then walked round to the front, lifted her latch with her own key, and stepped into the hall. Hilda started as if struck. The postcard lay in her hand. "Oh, Miss Marple, I thought Auntie sent me to air your rooms." "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "do put the card down. It is very difficult to explain an innocent visit when one begins by stealing the post." Hilda went white. For a long moment she was silent. Then her shoulders slumped. "I didn't mean wickedness. Only to see if there were more papers." "What a very useful if," said Miss Marple. "Shall we have some tea and talk about how you came to be looking for documents that other people have killed to obtain?" The kettle rattled, the cat inspected the guest, and Miss Marple set 2 cups on the tray. She did not hurry. One must never hurry a confession. When Hilda had sugared her tea into courage, Miss Marple folded her hands. "You wrote the note that was pinned to my gate," she said, not unkindly. "You did your best to copy Mr. Price's hand. The paper was ledger stock. Your aunt keeps the same brand behind the counter, and you walked across my bed to pin ivy in the latch, which left the faintest grit on the hall runner, a pale dust from the path near the vicarage. Also, your right heel leaves a neat nail mark. The cobbler on Fell Lane sets his tacks deeper. Only the travelling boot mender at the Friday market leaves them proud." Hilda stared. "How do you see that much?" "By living long," said Miss Marple, "and by washing steps as often as skirts. Tell me about the man from the city." Hilda bit her lip. "He came into the post office 3 times. Tall, pale, very polite. Said his name was Mr. Gray, but his letters were addressed to R.P. He asked if any registered parcels had come for the old mill. Then he asked if Miss Marple was expected back from Bath. He said he was a friend of yours." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "we must add flattery to his sins." "I didn't trust him at first," Hilda went on miserably, "but he talked so smooth. Said there were papers that could help the village, money for orphans and the roof fund. If only he could find them before bad men did. He asked me to keep an eye. Then he said your gardener had taken the papers, and that your life might be in danger if the wrong people thought you had them. I didn't know what to do. "So you told him when Mr. Price came and went," said Miss Marple, "and you took down the note he dictated." Hilda nodded, tears standing. "He said it would keep you safe. Then he made me go with him to the quarry path to ask Mr. Price to meet him there. He said he only wanted to frighten him into giving up the papers, but when Mr. Price came, the gentleman pushed him. I didn't see it fully. It was so fast, and he fell. After that, Mr. Gray, he said if I breathed a word, he'd say I did it. He made me wipe the spade and bury the tools, and I did it because I was afraid." "My dear child," said Miss Marple very gently, "fear is a far more dangerous stimulant than brandy. You were wicked, as frightened people are, but it is courageous to be truthful now. We shall tell Inspector Craddock everything." Hilda trembled. "Will I go to prison?" "You may answer for the note and for your after-diligence," said Miss Marple, "but you shall not answer for another's push." A knock sounded. Miss Marple smiled. "That will be the inspector. I asked him to come at 10. Wickedness is invariably punctual when it thinks it is early." Craddock entered, took in Hilda's face, the postcard, the teacups, and sat without invitation. Miss Marple, who approved of men who learned, didn't mind. "Miss Hilda," he said kindly, "we've traced Mr. Gray to a lodging-house near Yeovil, where he signed the register as Reginald Pemberton. He's already in custody on suspicion of murder. If you help us, the law will see the difference between fear and malice." Hilda told her story again, haltingly but fully. When she reached the word push, Craddock's pencil stopped, and he exhaled. "That will do," he said quietly. "You've done a bad, foolish thing, but you've stopped doing it. We shall take your statement." When she'd gone, shaken but strangely lighter, Craddock looked at Miss Marple with gruff gratitude. "You trapped her with a postcard." "Not so grand," said Miss Marple. "I merely left a saucer of cream where the cat had been sniffing. It is a mercy of Providence that guilt loves to tidy." Craddock smiled despite himself. "We have Pemberton, we have Hilda's statement, we have the deeds from the old mill. Is that the lot, then?" "Nearly," Miss Marple said, "but there is one more box to open. They went together to the quarry path at noon." The birches whispered, a lark rose with an indignant chirrup. Miss Marple led Craddock not to the pit but to the low bank where a lilac hedge trailed, a wild outpost of the very bush beneath which the tin box had been buried at her own cottage. "Villains," she observed, "are unimaginative gardeners. They return to the same hedge." She knelt, astonishingly nimble, and parted the leaves. There, pushed deep into the clay, lay a small oilskin packet. It came away with a sucking sigh. Inside was a folded paper, the ink smeared by damp but readable still. Memorandum. Harkness. Trust ya, Henry Pemberton, do make this private note that the deeds drawn in 1938 transferring parcel 711 were false in particulars of valuation and boundary. Agreed jointly with E. Blackwell. Witnessed H. Calthorpe under misunderstanding. Funds diverted to the account of R. Pemberton, minor. H. Pemberton. Craddock stared. Minor? The nephew? "Another Reginald," said Miss Marple. "The same boy who is now a man. The circle began as a theft for him and ends as a theft by him. The inheritance of sin is no fiction, Inspector. It is commonly compounded annually." Craddock's mouth twitched. "That will hang him, if the push won't." Miss Marple gave him the paper primly. "I detest hanging, but I dislike falling into quarries quite as much." She rose, dusting her hands. "There is a final service to perform." The parish hall filled that evening under the pretence of a roof fund meeting. Marleycombe preferred its justice social. Miss Marple sat beside Mrs. Calthorpe. Violet set out plates of seed cake. The vicar arranged his papers with the solemnity of Parliament. Inspector Craddock, in plain clothes, stood discreetly at the back. Miss Marple spoke not as a detective but as an old lady instructing children. She told a simple story of a trust betrayed long ago, of papers hidden and sought, of greed strutting in borrowed manners. She did not name Hilda. She named fear and cowardice, and then forgiveness, the way one might name difficult cousins at Christmas and then pass the pudding. When she finished, there was a silence that was almost respectful. Mrs. Pym, eyes bright, rose and said she would forgive certain ledger pages if they could be burned ceremoniously with other old rubbish. No one objected. Violet carried the tin box to the hearth, and the vicar, with a small devout frown, consigned the fraudulent copies to flame. The authentic memorandum, of course, went to the inspector. Afterwards, in the hush, Mrs. Calthorpe leaned close. "Is it over now, Miss Marple?" "Almost," Miss Marple said, and patted her hand. "The worst has been pulled up by the roots. 1 or 2 little weeds may sprout, but we know where to hoe." Craddock joined them at the door. "You've left me nothing to do but write reports," he said with mock resentment. "Nonsense," said Miss Marple. "You will carry heavy boxes, comfort frightened girls, and write to London men with long titles. I will make tea." He laughed then, and it was a good sound. That night Miss Marple set the small silver mirror on her mantel and looked into it with weary satisfaction. The village lay quiet. The lilac bush stirred only with the ordinary mischief of wind. In the mirror the firelight made a neat wreath about her head. She thought it looked less like a halo than a ticacy. "Thomas Price," she murmured, "rest easy. Your garden will have no more visitors after dark." She turned down the lamp, listening as the ticking clock settled back into its proper measure. Marleycombe exhaled, slowly, as after a long-held breath, and tucked itself beneath its modest quilt of night. Chapter 17. The last of the Harkness Papers. London, when one has the misfortune to need it, is best visited with a purpose and a warm scarf. Miss Marple had both. The letter from Inspector Craddock was brief. "Yard requests your presence regarding the Harkness documents. Bank interview set for Tuesday, 11 a.m., Chancery Lane." And she disliked to disappoint policemen who had learned to bring their pencils when she spoke. She took the early train and, with the reflex of long habit, chose a seat facing forward. Towns slipped past in a grey ribbon. The fields flattened into suburbs, and soon the soot-softened sky lay like a lid upon the city. Miss Marple alighted, found a taxi, and permitted herself one small sigh as the driver threaded into the legal streets where barristers walked 2 by 2 like clergymen. The bank in Chancery Lane was everything a bank ought to be. Polished, quiet, confidential. A discreet manager, Mr. Dale, received her in a room lined with green baize files and portraits of gentlemen with severe whiskers. "You are here about Box 73, he said, held originally in the name of Henry Pemberton, continued by his nephew Reginald. "There is a question of authority." "Quite," said Miss Marple gently. "Authority is one of those words that grows smaller the closer one looks." A second door opened. Inspector Craddock came in with a yard man, Inspector Marsh, whose calm conveyed the sort of competence Miss Marple approved. Behind them, to her mild surprise, followed Mr. Howard Penrith of Pemberton and Coldus, the very solicitor who had once carried Henry Blackwell's final envelope to her cottage. "Miss Marple," Penrith said with a modest bow, "we're all much obliged you could come." "Hardly heroic," said Miss Marple. "You have tea?" They did. London, for all its vices, was never so wicked as to forget tea when it asked favours. Marsh outlined the problem. Pemberton Jr. has been chary with answers. He claims Box 73 contains private correspondence and refuses consent to open. However, on grounds of suspected fraud and a pending charge, we can compel it if we satisfy the bank that the documents concern stolen trust. Property! Miss Marple peered at the neat ledger Mr. Dale placed before her. The original signature, H. Pemberton, was firm and spare. Later entries in a different hand marked payments for rental. Then, 2 months ago, a hurried scrawl, R. Pemberton. "Box 73, she said softly. "I think we should open it." Mr. Dale inclined his head with relief. "As you wish, Inspector. The warrant is in order." A few minutes later, in the vault's hushed chill, they stood before a steel drawer. A clerk, thin, ink-fingered, with the peculiar humility of men who handle other people's secrets, fetched it out and set it upon a table. His name, pinned neatly to his lapel, read, "Mr. Hollis." Craddock nodded to Mr. Dale. The manager inserted the bank's key. Inspector Marsh turned the warrant key. The lid lifted with a sound like a discreet cough. Inside lay 3 bundles. The first, a packet tied in red tape, was labelled Harkness Trust. Parcels, 7-11. The second, more carelessly wrapped in brown paper, bore private letters, H.P. The third was a small leather notebook cracked at the spine. Marsh reached for the red-taped bundle, but Miss Marple gently intercepted him. "If you please," she said, "we can save ourselves an hour." She undid the tape and spread the documents with the experienced hands of one who has ironed many a child's best shirt. They were what she expected. Deeds with tidy seals, valuations inflated like Sunday chests, and signatures properly placed. Henry Pemberton, Edmund Blackwell, Harold Calthorpe. In the margin of one valuation, an annotation caught her eye. To be adjusted for minor beneficiary. Minor, she murmured. Odd word for a boundary line, Craddock leaned in. The same word as in that memorandum we found under the lilac. Just so, said Miss Marple. A minor beneficiary, who was in fact a minor child, Reginald Pemberton, on whose account funds were diverted. Penrith, who had been quiet, spoke with grave composure. Miss Marple, the late Mr. Pemberton Senior, sometimes made private notes in a personal book. If that is the leather one. She opened the diary and read the tidy script on the first page. If Providence is merciful, I shall undo what Edmund and I began. I will leave a cipher with the parish accountant. The fund will return to the children for whom it was taken. Should Reginald ever demand this old sin to feed his new vices, let box 73 stand locked against him by decency, if not by law. H. Pemberton, 1940. Cipher, Craddock said. Mr. Dale beamed unexpectedly. If it concerns a parish account, perhaps the vicar holds it. Miss Marple smiled. Not our vicar in Marley Combe. The original Harkness parishes were in North London, but the habit travels. Box 73 was never a treasure box for thieves. It was a confession box for a penitent. Then why keep the forged deeds? Craddock demanded. Because sin is not easily erased, said Miss Marple. He kept the evidence, meaning to surrender it when he had arranged restitution. But the war came. Men died untidily, and years made everything difficult. Meanwhile, Reginald found the ledger reference to minor beneficiary and imagined it pointed to riches. He has been trying to pry open a repentance he did not inherit. Inspector Marsh closed the diary with official care. That will do for the court, he said. As for restitution, we will manage it, Penrith finished quietly. Our firm, reduced and repentant as we are, still knows how to draw up a decent deed of gift. If Mr. Dale and Inspector Marsh will permit, we can transfer the surplus retained from fees, with this diary as moral authority, to the present Harkness Orphans scheme. Mr. Dale looked relieved. Banks, he said, enjoy moral authority. So do villages, Miss Marple said, and I think a roof in Marley Combe will be grateful for sound timber bought with money that has finally remembered what it is for. She bundled the forged deeds, now evidence, and set them in Marsh's case. The private letters she left, they belonged to ghosts. Then she glanced, almost idly, at Mr. Hollis, the clerk, who stood attentive, hands folded. A splash of blue-black ink stained his right thumb, fresh, and on his cuff a faint, sweetish scent lingered, like bitter almonds softened by soap. Mr. Hollis, she said pleasantly, when you fetched the drawer, did you happen to handle any laboratory bottles this morning? The man blinked. Me, miss? I don't go near the chemist's. No, said Miss Marple almost to herself, but you go near pen nibs, and the washer you used on this cuff has not yet lost the smell of cyanide. Curious. Craddock's head snapped round. Cyanide? Hollis made a small, helpless gesture. You can smell anything if you expect it. I helped tidy the strong room. Perhaps an old envelope. Miss Marple's voice remained mild, but it lost all fluff. The mirror behind the high table in Bath reflected a hand reaching for Dr. Herridge's glass. I knew it was not a waiter's hand. It had the careful, ink-stained fingers of a clerk. You were there, Mr. Hollis, as a temporary hire for the hotel's books. The Royal Crescent sends their ledgers twice a year to Chancery Lane for balancing. You were present the week of the conference, and you read, a week later, the same newspapers we did, and guessed I might someday be here to ask the bank to open a drawer your accomplice wished to keep closed. Reginald needed a hand in London. He found yours. Hollis's shoulders sagged. He looked very small under the green lamps. I only meant to earn a bit, he mumbled. Mr. Pemberton said it was just a trick with a box. The professor in Bath. That was Herridge's quarrel, not mine. I only swapped a glass when told. Inspector Marsh's face did not change, but his voice grew very gentle, which Miss Marple had learned to mistrust. You will state that clearly at the yard, Mr. Hollis. They took him without fuss. The vault returned to its hush. Miss Marple felt suddenly very old and very fond of lamplight that fell on knitting instead of sins. When it was done, Penrith accompanied her to the street. A pale sun broke through the soot-coloured clouds. London looked almost kind. Miss Marple, he said, you have given the law its proof and the children their due. May I drive you to the station? Thank you, she said, but I should like to walk a little. One sees more on foot, and I prefer not to leave London without observing at least 3 instances of human folly to keep my expectations in order," he smiled. "You have only to look at Fleet Street for that." She took his arm after all because it was offered properly. At the corner she stopped and looked up at the wash of cloud. "It is a droll thing," she said, "how evil inherits itself like a cracked teacup, the fault running along the same line generation after generation, unless someone puts the cup away." "And today," Penrith said, "you have put it away." "Not I," said Miss Marple. "The late Mr. Pemberton did, clumsily, tardily, but sincerely. We have only snapped the lock shut." On the journey back to Marleycombe, she watched the fields return, one by one, like polite acquaintances. In her reticule lay a letter from Mr. Dale promising cooperation. In her head lay a list. Write to the vicar, telephone Mrs. Calthorpe, ask Violet for seed cake on Tuesday. Remind Inspector Craddock that victory is unwholesome without tea. At dusk she reached her gate. The lilac stirred in a small, unthreatening breeze. She paused, listening to the village breathe, a contented sound like a child sleeping. Inside, the mirror caught the first wink of lamp flame and tossed it back. "Nearly finished," she told the quiet house. "Stories end the way gardens do, with the weeds pulled, the path swept, and 1 or 2 seeds tucked in for what comes next." She set the kettle on, laid out a single cup, and smiled when she realized she had laid out 2. Habits, like tales, have a way of expecting company. Chapter 18. A Village Settles Its Accounts. April. Sunlight lay softly on Marleycombe, as if the sky itself had decided to be kind. The hedges wore a thin green mist. Lambs startled themselves into sudden leaps. The church bell sounded less like admonition and more like an old friend calling across the fields. Miss Marple eased open her gate and inspected the lilac. Its buds were tight and honest. She approved of honest buds. On her hall table lay 2 letters awaiting stamps. One for Mr. Dale in Chancery Lane, acknowledging receipt of the bank's proposal, the other for Mr. Penrith, agreeing to his suggested instrument of restitution. The law, she reflected, was at its best when it pretended to be housekeeping. By 10 o'clock, she had paid calls enough to be fully apprised of the village's mood. It was a mood composed of equal parts relief, curiosity, and a faint irritability that there was no further scandal to improve the scones. The vicar, however, had found a respectable replacement, the roof fund. He had posted a notice outside the porch in his stout hand. Parish roof appeal, Thanksgiving meeting, and jumble sale. Saturday next. Donations gratefully received. Accounts to be read in full. "In full," Miss Marple murmured, passing the board, a most encouraging phrase. At the old mill, Mrs. Calthorpe presided over a scene of industrious calm. Violet, brisk and rosy, arranged seed cakes with the authority of a magistrate. A ladder leaned against the pantry door, where Harold Calthorpe, returned to a life of mending rather than wandering, replaced a hinge with apprentice solemnity. "You bring news, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Calthorpe asked, eyes anxious but hopeful. "Yes, my dear. The bank has agreed to release a sum, modest by the standards of those who like large words, but very sufficient for a roof. The remainder will go to the Harkness Orphans Fund. It is not the past undone, but it is the future slightly improved." Mrs. Calthorpe's hands trembled. "We owe you everything." "Nonsense," said Miss Marple. "You owe me a bun. Courage is what paid the bill." Violet brought one on a plate and stood hovering like a blessed ghost. "Are we?" she faltered. "Are we quite safe now?" "As safe as people ever are," Miss Marple said cheerfully, "which is to say, not at all, and yet sufficiently." She did not add that there was one small weed left to pull. It grew not in London vaults or quarry shadows, but in the thin, sour soil of opportunism. If evil enjoyed grand conspiracies, petty vice preferred errands, and someone had run errands for Reginald Pemberton. The thought accompanied her home as a tune accompanies a walk. In her sitting room, she placed on the mantel the small silver mirror that had travelled with her to Bath and back. It liked the angle of the light there. She took out a sheet of paper and wrote 3 invitations in her even schoolroom hand. Mrs. Pym, Mrs. Dacres, Mr. Silas Vane, dealer in books and curios, Yeovil Road. The first 2 were for decency, the 3rd for justice. Mr. Vane had been seen twice in Marleycombe in recent weeks, once to offer the vicar a lot of rare parish registers at a price that suggested the registers had turned to gold, again to inquire at the Bluebell whether Miss Marple might be interested in purchasing old legal papers as souvenirs. A foolish man, which is only another way of saying a dangerous one. She requested their company for tea on Friday to discuss donations for the jumble and the proper cataloguing of any books. The phrase proper cataloguing has a remarkable power upon people who hoard paper. It makes them feel simultaneously virtuous and a little afraid. On Friday, precisely at 4, the party assembled. Mrs. Pym arrived in a flutter of righteous eagerness. Mrs. Dacres came armed with a notebook and the firm conviction that if lists were written, sin could be kept at bay. Mr. Vane appeared last, carrying a canvas satchel and wearing his most ingratiating smile. He smelled faintly of damp cloth and calculation. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, bowing, "your name is a byword even in Yeovil." "I hope in pleasant contexts," Miss Marple replied, pouring tea. "Sugar, 2 lumps, I think, and perhaps a plate for your papers." He brightened. "Papers, yes. I have come into possession, purely through legitimate trade, of certain items touching on the Harkness Trust. Pedigrees, valuations, maps. Historical, you understand, of interest to the parish and to collectors who can be very helpful to parish roofs." Mrs. Pym's eyes widened. "Historical? Auntie always says," Miss Marple agreed gently, "that ledger paper is the backbone of civilization." Mrs. Dacres, ever precise, asked what price Mr. Vane thought helpful might mean. Mr. Vane spread his hands. "Why, in the way of a donation. One would leave such matters to the committee, naturally. My role is humbler, simply to place these curios where they will be appreciated." He set the canvas satchel on the table and made a small flourish of its mouth. Miss Marple did not look at the contents. She looked at his fingers. There, on the right forefinger, a faint smear of purple-black where cheap duplicating ink dries too slowly. At the nail, a hairline pairing of sealing wax, brown rather than red. He had been busy making history. She placed before him a small pile of envelopes. "Before we admire things, Mr. Vane, I must trouble you with an errand. The vicar is compiling the donors' list and insists on stamped acknowledgements. If you would be so kind as to address these 3 envelopes to yourself, as demonstration, we shall see the spacing suits our ledger." He hesitated. It is the nature of guilty men to hesitate at trifles, and then, deciding the request was beneath suspicion, took up her pen. He wrote Mr. Silas Vane 3 times, each in a neat, slightly fussy hand. Miss Marple set the envelopes aside, quite satisfied. She had already that morning asked Mrs. Pym to bring along the anonymous letter that had sent a key to the old mill months before. The loops and slants matched. Vanity is a signature that seldom learns disguise. "Now," Miss Marple said brightly, "let us see these historical treasures." He drew them out one by one, maps with florid borders, valuations in a clerkly hand, a memorandum that, to the untrained eye, looked convincing enough. To Miss Marple, who had learned her penmanship at a time when it improved the character as much as the page, each sheet shouted its falsehood. The paper was wrong, new rag, too white, the ink had an impatient shine, and the seals— the seals had been pressed with a button rather than a die. Mrs. Dacres sniffed delicately. "I should, of course, insist upon provenance." "Provenance," Mr. Vane said at once, "will be furnished." "It will not," Miss Marple said, so pleasantly that he smiled before he understood. "Mr. Vane, you are what my old headmistress called a misdirected energy. You provided Mr. Pemberton with information about our village. You were seen leaving the Yeovil lodging-house he used. You forged these papers at his request, to be traded piecemeal among country collectors who like a scandal with their sherry. Fortunately for our roof, you are worse at forgery than you are at flattery." He sat quite still. Guilt has a way of testing chairs. "You cannot prove," he began. "Oh, but we can," Mrs. Pym burst in, suddenly valiant. "Auntie keeps everything, Mr. Vane, including the note you left asking if Miss Marple would care to see Box 73 duplicates. Duplicates, and on the very same ledger paper as our accounts. I told Auntie that was— what did you call it, miss? Improvident." "Imprudent, my dear," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Improvident is a cousin of it who lives beyond his means." Mrs. Dacres closed her notebook with a finality that in other centuries would have been the slam of a dungeon door. "I shall fetch the inspector," she said, and went out with the swiftness of a woman whose feet have at last found their purpose. Mr. Vane's smile collapsed. "I only wanted my share," he muttered. "There's always a share with gentlemen. This town is all cake and sermons and none for a man who brings the spice." "My dear Mr. Vane," Miss Marple said kindly, "spice turns to ash when one steals it from the pudding. You will give the inspector a list of every collector you have approached and every sheet you have sold. You will write letters recalling them in the name of decency and the law. And afterwards, because the roof needs mending, you will make a donation of the precise amount you had meant to pocket." He glared, then deflated. "How much?" "Enough to sting," said Miss Marple, "and not enough to cripple. The vicar will advise." By the time Inspector Craddock arrived, Mr. Vane was resigned to confessing, a habit Miss Marple approved in men who had run out of better ones. He went away between constable and conscience, and the room felt immediately tidier. "Neatly done," Craddock said, accepting tea. "A forgery footman to our fallen heir. I should have thought of that." "You were busy writing letters with long titles," Miss Marple said. "And besides, this was parish work. Villages prefer to sweep their own hearth." Saturday came bright and brisk. The jumble sale spread its cheerful disorder over the parish lawn. Hats with opinions, books with secrets, china that remembered better, rooms. Miss Marple took a small table beneath the chestnut and labelled boxes with the patient hand of authority. The meeting followed. The vicar, chest puffed with relief and humility, read out the accounts in full. The figures made the roof sound possible. Mrs. Pym produced Mr. Vane's donation to a small, gratifying gasp. Mrs. Dacres announced that the improperly historical papers had been recovered and would be sent where they could do no further harm, meaning the yard's deep cupboards. Violet sold out of seed cake in 20 minutes, and looked as though absolution had a flavour after all. When it was done, Miss Marple stood a little apart and watched Marley Combe live. It was an ordinary sight, which is the rarest and best. Children, free of murder, chased one another round the chestnut. Harold Calthorpe talked timber with the blacksmith, both assuming the other knew less than he did, an assumption that is the foundation of British friendship. Mrs. Weatherby advised the vicar on sermons as though they were puddings. Inspector Craddock, having failed to escape without a paper hat thrust on him, bore it with stoic dignity. He came to stand beside Miss Marple, tugging the hat from his head. "Is it over?" he asked, half joking and half hoping. "As much as anything is ever over," she said. "The past has paid something on account. The future will send its bill in due course." He smiled. "You do love an epilogue." "I love tidy drawers," she corrected. "Epilogues are only drawers with labels." He glanced toward the church. "The roof will hold then." "For a time," she said. "Nothing on earth holds forever, but it will keep the rain off the hymns, which is the point." They walked together to the gate. A thrush tried a few notes and thought better of it. The chestnut leaves made a new, green shade. "You'll tell me when the story is over?" he said lightly. "Certainly," said Miss Marple, "when there is no more tea to pour and nothing growing under the lilac, which is to say, soon." That evening at her cottage she set the silver mirror on the mantel and watched it snatch a small coin of flame from the grate and toss it back. She wrote a single line at the bottom of her notebook. Vane confessed. Restitution arranged. Box 73 closed. Marley Combe breathing evenly. Then she closed the book, not with finality, but with that domestic satisfaction of a chapter whose edges lie flat. She poured herself tea, exactly as hot as it ought to be, and listened while the village went on being itself. A door closing, a bicycle bell, a laugh passing up the lane like a lantern. Accounts settled, she told the quiet room, with a little left over for the unexpected. Outside, the lilac held its buds like promises. Inside, the clock kept time without hurry. And Miss Marple, who disliked both melodrama and complacency, folded her hands and let contentment sit for a moment, like a guest who knows when to rise. Chapter 19. The Lilac in Bloom. Spring came up Marley Combe Lane with the modesty that suits English things best. It did not parade, it simply arrived. A faint green across the hedges, a cleanness in the air, and at Miss Marple's gate, the first pale cones of lilac pushing shyly from their sheaths. She paused there each morning to look, not long, just long enough to be certain of progress. People, she often said, must be coaxed toward goodness. Lilac required only patience. Inside, the thatched cottage had resumed its ordinary rhythm. The clock ticked, the kettle sang, and a sheet of notepaper lay upon the writing desk headed, in Miss Marple's neat hand. The Marley Combe affair. Private memorandum. She had been adding to it in small instalments. A line for the quarry and poor Thomas Price, a line for the deeds unearthed, a line for Reginald Pemberton and the bank, a quite tiny line for Mr. Hollis, clerk, and most recently a brisk satisfied line for Mr. Silas Vane. Confession entered, donation received, moral improved. When Inspector Craddock stopped by that afternoon, as he did now without apology, and Miss Marple suspected without precise reason, he found her placing a sprig of lilac in a glass. "You will think me sentimental," she said, "but I dislike to let a season pass without proof that it occurred." He grinned, tired and cheerful. "If every village had your sort of sentiment, we'd put most prisons out of business." "Not at all," said Miss Marple. "We'd merely make them smaller and tidier." He settled by the hearth. "News from London. Pemberton has entered a plea, manslaughter for the quarry, and a more complicated assortment of fraud charges for the rest. Hollis is cooperating. He'll go down gently." Mr. Penrith's arrangements were approved. Money's on its way to the roof appeal and the Harkness children. And Vane, well, the magistrate spoke of public-spirited repentance with a straight face. "You have friends even among benches." "One mustn't rely on them," Miss Marple said, "but it's pleasant when they appear." Craddock hesitated, then pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I had this typed up for you. Call it a personal indulgence." He handed it over. It was a brief letter on yard stationery, formal as a school prize. "The cooperation of Miss Jane Marple in the matter of the Harkness Trust and associated crimes is here recorded with appreciation. Signed, neatly, by Inspector Marsh." Miss Marple blinked. "How very civilized of them. I shall put it under the clock. Authority, like jam, keeps best when aired." He stood, glanced toward the window and gave a small theatrical bow. "The village expects me to hammer a nail into the church roof to prove I'm useful. Shall I escort you to the green?" "I will follow," said Miss Marple. "There is a small task first, of the kind only a foolish old woman can do without being suspected of cleverness." It was a short walk to the old mill. The bells were being hoisted from the vicarage shed. Children carried bunting with the solemnity of sacristans, and Violet, flourishing a feather duster like a baton, conducted the afternoon bustle into a cheerful order. "You're in command, I see," Miss Marple said. Violet coloured with pleasure. "Mrs. Calthorpe says I take after my aunt for fussing, miss. Only she means it kindly. We've orders for 20 seed cakes for the roof meeting, fancy that." "Fame," Miss Marple observed, "is always freest with those who deserve it least, and never forgets to call on those who deserve it most. Will you do me a favour? In your pantry cupboard, the high shelf, there is a little brass key on a ribbon. Would you bring it?" Violet fetched it at once. "We keep it for the old cellar chest." "Quite so, but we shall give it a better home." Miss Marple placed the key into a small envelope and wrote, "Without fuss," to Inspector Craddock. "Key to the past. Slip that into the police bag when the inspector arrives. I dislike leaving mementos for burglars, and it is time even small ghosts were properly catalogued." Violet laughed, then sobered. "Miss, do you ever think of Mr. Blackwell? I try not to, and then sometimes I do." "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "of 2 letters he wrote. One to a frightened girl and one to a woman who made a mistake and remembered to be sorry. A man should be remembered by his best letter if there is one." Violet nodded, and her eyes shone without tears. In the parlour, Mrs. Calthorpe and her husband pored over a paper from Mr. Penrith's office. "I never thought to see our name and the word restoration on the same line," Mrs. Calthorpe said, half laughing, half incredulous. "It used to be arrears." "Restoration suits you," Miss Marple said. "Arrears never did." The jumble in accounts had the agreeable air of an event that knew its limits. Tables sagged under useful tat, boots that remembered miles, crockery determined to be chipped honestly rather than expensively, hymnals that had underlined their theology with gravy. The vicar, swept along by efficiency he had not created, read out the figures. There was an audible sigh when the total appeared, astonishment tipping promptly into pride. A builder from Yeovil spoke about timbers. A child dropped a penny into a collecting tin as if launching a ship. "Human nature," Miss Marple remarked to Mrs. Pym, "is at its best when it counts aloud." "Counting keeps one honest," Mrs. Pym agreed. "Auntie always says." "That ledger paper is the backbone of civilization. I shouldn't wonder," Miss Marple finished, and they both laughed. Inspector Craddock, seized by 2 choir boys and a length of bunting, achieved a respectable contribution on a stepladder. Mrs. Dacres, who had privately feared roofs since childhood, beamed as though the heavens had been tided. The wind rustled the chestnut leaves. Somewhere a thrush decided the weather could be trusted and tried a phrase of song. Miss Marple slipped away before the applause, as she preferred to leave triumphs to people who enjoyed them and problems to those who deserved them. The lane was bright, the puddles honest, and the scent from her lilac at the gate more definite than yesterday. She picked one small spray, no more, greed-spoiled flowers, and set it in the hall where the April light could find it. On her desk, the private memorandum waited to be finished. She drew the chair forward and added the last tidy lines. Postscript. Reginald Pemberton. Plea entered, sentence pending, proceeds recovered for proper use. Hollis. Confession helpful. Mischief likely to diminish. Recommend decent employment away from ledgers. Vane. Forgery stopped. Donation exacted. Future to be watched. Moral probably shallow-rooted. The old mill, key surrendered, cellar emptied of history, cakes reliable. Parish roof. Accounts read in full, virtue suitably bored and therefore safe. On causes. Evil begins in little lies told to save time. It ends by costing everybody's. On remedies. Tea, daylight, ledgers, and when necessary, traps baited with postcards. She set down the pen, sprinkled a little sand, and smiled at the ridiculousness of sand in an age that had discovered blotting paper and murder by telephone. Habits, like villages, were worth saving when they did no harm. A knock, polite, confident, came at the door. Miss Marple knew it without looking. Inspector Craddock, hat in hand, stood upon the step with the modest bravado of a man who had just been made to wield bunting. "You slipped away," he accused. "Modesty," said Miss Marple, "is a sort of housekeeping." He peered around her shoulder. "Writing the last page?" "Only stopping before I become dull." He sobered a little. "There's something I've wanted to say, and I may not have the chance again without sounding official. You saved a good many people pain they'd have deserved and a few people pain they didn't. That's as near to justice as the world gets." Miss Marple received this as she received rain, a condition of life rather than an event. "Justice," she said, "is a well-mended roof. No one looks up to admire it. They merely don't get wet." They took a turn in the garden. The tidy borders wore the respectable look of plants that had never been lectured at, but nevertheless tried to do well. Craddock paused by the lilac. "So that's the bush where villains bury their souls." "Among other things," Miss Marple said, "but it does them no good. The roots are occupied." He laughed, then looked down the lane toward the church. "I suppose I shan't be back for a while. The Yard wants me on a case at Exeter. Don't solve anything spectacular while I'm gone." "I never solve anything," Miss Marple said. "I merely notice what people have put in the wrong drawer." He shook her hand, awkward and warm. "Goodbye, Miss Marple." "Not goodbye," she corrected. "Good tea. You will have some when you return." He went, and the lane regained its ordinary noises, a bicycle bell, a dog's indignant bark at nothing in particular, a cartwheel thinking about mud. Miss Marple stood for a moment with the lilac scent in the air, and the sense, rarely earned and quickly spent, that an account had come square. She went inside, placed the memorandum in her desk, and took up the small silver mirror Alice Wren had left her. It caught her face, and the room, and faintly, the garden behind. A trifling piece of vanity turned by intention into a tool for reflection. "A woman who sees too clearly," she said to the empty cottage, "must sometimes close her eyes, but not yet." The kettle boiled. She poured one cup, then, by habit, set out a second, smiled at herself, and put it back. From the church came the first trial taps on timber, the builder sounding the new beams. They answered with a solid, satisfied note. Marleycombe, which had been frightened all winter, exhaled as villages exhale, not with speeches, but with errands resumed. Miss Marple carried her tea to the window. In the glass she could see the lilac at the gate, and, beyond it, the bend of the road that led away to Bath and London and other people's mistakes. She was not sorry for those journeys, but she was content that, for the moment, no one needed her to point out a crumb on the moral tablecloth. The clock chimed the quarter. She drank, set the cup down, and closed her eyes for the length of 2 heartbeats. When she opened them, the day was just the day again, blessedly ordinary, which is to say safe in the only way safety is ever offered. She wrote one final line at the bottom of her notebook, lilac in bloom, all thrums fastened, end. Then she shut the book, placed it neatly in the drawer, and went out to deadhead a rose that had got above itself. The wind, obliging as ever, turned the lilac toward the sun,